Hey guys, tonight we drift up a rutted lane as the day loosens its grip, and the first cold star blinks above a roofline of grey slate. The cloister gate waits ahead, wood old enough to remember storms you've only read about, iron bands dark as wet river stone. A bell swells through the evening like a bronze tide, and you feel the sound in your ribs, slow and steady, the way a harbour buoys a boat. Torchlight lifts, barley-scented air rolls out, and a figure in a hood gestures you inside. You're about to spend the night where the timetable is written in bells and steam, and the to-do list is as simple as grain, water, patience. Of course, you probably won't survive this, by which I mean you'll be asleep long before we hit the boil. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing the map fill in every night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand beneath the arch as the last of the day rinses off the stones. The gatehouse smells of beeswax and damp oak. Under your hand the door is cool, swollen with centuries of winter and thaw. Inside, the courtyard is a square of hush. Cloister walks wrap the garden, their columns casting a comb of shadows. A narrow rill of water whispers along the path's edge, and every footstep learns to tiptoe. The bell peals again, one long, two short, and you feel how sound here is not showy, not bossy, just accurate. You time your breath to it without trying. A lay brother waves you forward, sleeve ash-dusted, hands the colour of toasted crust. His grin arrives before his face does. Late, but not too late, he says, and you pretend that was exactly your plan. First joke. You are, as always, fashionably punctual for people who measure fashion in centuries. He steers you past the refectory, where trestles sleep under linen like boats under white sails, past a door carved with grapes and a very earnest fish. The cloister garden holds a last soft green in its centre, a square of herbs and low fruit trees, and the air tastes faintly of mint that snuck into chilly dusk against all advice. A lantern bobs ahead, then another. The brewery's warm mouth exhales a bread-sweet breath that settles your shoulders. This is not a tavern, it's a workshop that happens to hum like a lullaby. Copper flashes in the half-light, a kiln's belly mutters, and the floorboards remember every bucket carried across them. A second bell strokes the air. The lay brother, Brother Martin, you learn counts on his fingers, a habit pure muscle memory. That was the quarter before Vespers, he says. We'll finish the last crush and set the mash to bed. You nod like someone who sets mashes to bed all the time, which is to say, you nod politely and try to look trustworthy around hot liquids. Second joke. Your resume currently reads, can hold a spoon and hopes for the best. There's a rhythm here that doesn't ask your permission. You fall into it. Sound is the metronome, yes, but light is the melody. Coals nested under the kiln blink and fade. Lanterns stutter with a moth's brave insistence, and the moon paces the cloister garth like a shy guest leaving early. Somewhere beyond the wall, a road turns to ribbon and disappears. Within, you are contained, tended, timed. Mainstream fact slips in as gently as steam. Medieval monastic communities across Europe truly did use bells to structure nearly every task, prayer, and pause in their day. The rule of street. Benedict, composed in the 6th century, made that cadence a habit of centuries, telling men with few clocks exactly when to pray, to read, to labour, to rest. Here, the bell is both calendar and conscience. Brother Martin hears the tone, not as noise, but as a verb. It tells him to draw water now, to cool later, to stir when shadows reach the third window. He shows you a rope pull by the door, polished by hands enough to qualify as a humble relic. A cat slides past your ankles, brewery-coloured malt grey with a foam-white bib, and you realise this place has its own staff keeping the grain bins honest. Quirky tidbit. Cats in breweries are not a quaint Instagram invention. They were, and are, practical colleagues, rodent control specialists with payment in scraps and warm naps. This one twines your calves like you owe it back pay. You pass the mill room where the crush is almost done, grain husks catching the light like small ships' sails. The quern's wheel sits quiet now, but the air still thrums with the low memory of grinding. Dust hangs in sun-brown sheets near a high-slit window. Someone's drawn a little cross with a fingertip where the dust settled thick as talc. Brother Martin taps the millstone affectionately and says, "No one remembers the mill until they remember the beer. You file that away for later, in case you ever need to sound wise beside a heavy object." At the threshold, You pause to absorb the geography of the place. To your left, the mash tun glows faintly, a broad-bellied vat with a wooden mash paddle leaning against it like a scythe that learned to stir. To your right, the kiln's vent coughs a warm breath of barley, today's malt still holding a ghost of green. Overhead, rafters stitched with old soot cross like quiet ribs. Someone has hung bunches of dried herbs up there, a constellation of yarrow and mugwort, and, don't you dare mix these up, bundles that promise a later lesson. A slate board near the door chalks the day's plan. Grist in black, water in grey, bell marks in tidy circles. You love a to-do list. This one will not betray you. Your hands, Brother Martin says, and you realise he's not speaking metaphorically. He takes your wrists, palms up, and turns them into the light. The ASMR of warm water over a wooden basin begins. Trickle, patter, pause. He pours. You breathe. He rubs a thumb along your knuckles to coax out the road. Dust, gentle, practical, a ritual without incense. Clean in, clean out, he murmurs. And you consider how much of life could improve by obeying that one-line manual. Third joke. If only your inbox had a holy water stoop. Historians still argue whether the monastery at night felt busier than a small town, because when the bells ran the schedule and ale was both sustenance and income, brewing could bend the day into shapes no lay household risked. Some scholars paint a picture of ceaseless motion. Others insist the work folded into prayer so neatly you'd never see the seams. You decide, here and now, that both can be true. The room hums, but your pulse slows. Brother Martin guides you into the gentle chaos of readiness. He shows you the grain sacks stacked like tame dunes. He tugs one open and lets you breathe in the sweet cereal heart of it. This batch, he says, is for the travellers at the gate and the brothers after labour. He points to another sack with a charcoal mark, a fish scratched in swift lines. Friday, he explains. A shorthand anyone passing could read. Lighter fare when fasting leans in. The bell nudges the air again. Vespers and a second lay brother appears, makes a small cross over the tun, and disappears as silently. The motion is not superstition. It's memory sculpted into gesture, like knot tying before a storm. Stone under your boots absorbs sound, gives it back as a whisper. The boiler creaks as it settles, the way big metal sighs when it knows there's work tomorrow. You glance to the far end where a door stands slightly ajar, and through it a ribbon of chant slides in, thin as a blade of grass. The community is at prayer, and you, grain-dusted, are part of the offertory of labour. Brother Martin lifts the mash paddle as if it were a processional candle. Soon, he says, we'll soak the grist while the brothers sing, and the steam will tell us stories we've heard too many times to count. You imagine steam as a gossip, what it saw when the abbey was younger, when the gate was new, when a winter froze the rill so hard the boys skated crooked circles before anyone could scold them. He gestures to the door. A moment outside, he suggests, and you follow him into the cloister walk where night has finally committed. The garden's scent turns cooler, the mint less braggy, the rosemary more resolved. The sky leans closer, stars flicked like spilled grain. You pace the walk, feel the old stones choose your cadence for you. There's a reason monasteries grew cloisters like hearts, enclosing a garden, enclosing a well, a place to circle and hear your own feet return. Another mainstream truth murmurs in, cloisters were not merely corridors, they were engines of study and care, funneling monks between church, refectory, dormitory, and workrooms, letting the day's rhythm hold without breaking. You let the corridor own your footsteps. The bell gives a final soft command. The chant fades. Brother Martin nods, and you step back into the warmth where the night's first water waits to meet its grain. You take one last look at the board, the neat circles of time, the chalk smudges like small moons, and feel your shoulders loosen, as if someone traded your bones for soft rope. The cat claims your ankles again and then, satisfied with the inspection, disappears under a bench like a boss who trusts you now. The brewery breathes. You breathe with it. You step closer to the slate board, and Brother Martin's knuckle taps each chalked circle like a drum lesson you didn't know you signed up for. The rule, he says, as if introducing a favourite psalm, gives the shape. The bell gives the bones. He means the rule of street. Benedict, the 6th century handbook that tells this place how to breathe, so you let your breathing fall in with the little circles. You don't need a wristwatch. You've got bronze in a tower, a rope polished like a seashell, and a calendar that runs on steam and chant. A faint chime from across the garth shivers the rafters. It isn't loud, it's precise, like a spoon on glass. That's for the reading before Compline, Martin notes, and you file it between grain and glow. The hours unspool in your head as he traces a litany across the board. Night vigils, when even the cat looks offended. Lords, when the east window blushes. The once existent prime retired in later centuries, but in your long night it still stretches like a yawn. Then terce, sext, and none third. Sixth, ninth, more honest than names with weekdays in them. Vespers for the pink of evening. Compline for the hush. One mainstream fact fits neatly here. Monasteries across medieval Europe measured their days by these canonical hours, long before reliable mechanical clocks, using bells to collect bodies and minds into one task at a time, whether that was psalms, study, or stirring a mash. He points to grist, paired with a small circle beside lords. Grain meets water when dawn does, so the mash can rest like a well-tucked child while the brothers read. Fire feeds the boil between terce and sext, because lunch wants heat, and the kitchen likes to borrow coals from the furnace's heart. Racking and cooling lean toward none and vespers, when the air goes sensible, and the coolships can actually perform their coolship duties rather than reenacting a sauna. Sleep creeps in under Compline like a polite thief. Your day locks to their day, and you realize how little you've trusted time that didn't come from a screen telling you it knows everything. Not all bells are equal, Martin adds, eyeing the tower through a narrow window. Our big bell calls a body, the small bell calls a hand. In other words, the great bronze summons the community to chapel. The lighter tongue ticks the brewery's metronome. Another brother is the horologer, the unofficial timekeeper who feels the air, reads the light, and knows by the smell of the kiln when sext is near. Quirky tidbit for your collection. Some houses kept little tide dials, stone sundials etched on the church wall to cue the hours by shadow. Others used notched candles to burn down to a pin at a certain prayer. A practical solution, unless a draft moves the schedule forward by 20 minutes, and the abbot has to blame the Holy Spirit for everyone being early. The rope to the brewery bell sways a little with the evening's last breath. Martin runs it once, and a soft note shivers the wood. He stops it with a palm, like a musician damping a string. We time our steps to this, he says. We time our pouring, we time our hands. He shows you the ledger marks that ride beside the circles, graceful numerals, a few Latin abbreviations, a monastic spreadsheet you can nearly taste. First light joke. Yes, you are absolutely ready to live inside a spreadsheet if it smells like toast and malt. He taps a column labelled hospites, and another for pauperes guests. And poor, because the bell doesn't just run a brewhouse, it sets out generosity like a table. The ale you're helping with will warm more than the brothers' bellies. The tower tells charity when to start. Historians still argue whether Benedict intended a single strict rhythm for all monasteries, or whether local conditions, latitude, harvests, winters that make iron complain meant the bell was always a little interpretive dance. In colder climates, brewing leaned toward hours when the air cooperated. In warm valleys, monks coaxed shade, and bells nudged tasks into corridors of cooler light. You find a reassurance in that wiggle room. Holiness doesn't mind a practical workaround when yeast is involved. You move with Martin through a small door into a passage where chalk notes bloom along the plaster. A crude sun with rays marks where winter light hits at sext. A thin line marks where summer light lies at none. Brother Aelred drew those with a string and stubbornness, Martin says. Missed his dinner twice. Claimed geometry was a fasting food. Second light joke. If only your own diet had the same results as drawing circles on walls. The chalk is old but freshened, like a tradition that refuses to become merely decorative. Silence lives here, but it's not the scolding kind. You learn the house's small talk is hands. Martin teaches you a gesture, a fist tilted to the mouth to ask for ale without words, when the rule guard's quiet. There's one for books, one for bread, one for please pass the mash paddle, unless you want my forearms to fall off. The sign language travelled from kitchen to scriptorium to cellar, a monastic emoji set with better theology. Another quirky thread. Some monasteries kept entire talking tables of agreed signs. The sign for cheese, one chronicler swears, involved turning an imaginary wheel. You practice the ale sign. Martin bows as if you'd mastered a violin. Back at the slate, he sketches tomorrow's bell plan while you watch the kiln glow to a peach. He writes Parvi small beer for a section alongside charity. Forte's stronger brew for feast days and winter labour. He circles a note. Feriae fast days, and you remember the sack marked with a fish. Bells don't just ring time, They ring in tension. The day bends to care for bodies, to make room for prayer, to share what can be spared. A question tugs your sleeve. How did they manage the truly awkward hours, those hungry teeth of the night when even stars look bored? Martin answers without your asking. Vigils, he says, teach you how long a minute is. He smiles, not sorry at all. The bell at night is a gentler creature. The ringer swaddles the clapper, so the call is more nudge than trumpet. Once awake, the community becomes a slow river of candlelight. In winter, the brewery borrows the moment, soaking grist while chants ladder the dark, trusting that heat will meet it at terse. You picture the cat supervising from a sack with professional detachment. You ask your bravest question, what if the bell fails? Martin's eyes go to the ceiling as if to ask the rafters' consent. Then our noses and the psalms conspire, he says. Also, Brother Petrus. Petrus, it turns out, is a human alarm clock, gifted in the art of waking men, with a tap on the foot and not getting punched. Your mattress at home has never tried anything so personal. Third light joke. If your phone alarm were named Petrus and carried a feather, you might hate mornings less. He opens a chest and shows you a sand glass, an hourglass with a thin waist and the patience of geology. For the boil, he explains. If the wind muddles sound or the bell rope sulks in rain, we let sand do the sermon. He turns it, and time begins to fall with the softest hiss. You realize how many clocks the house really keeps. Bronze and shadow, sand and smoke, breath and habit. The rule is not a cage. It's a choreography. A final bell strokes the night, and Martin listens the way a sailor does for the sea. He smiles. Compline, he says, we will bank the fires and let the yeast do what bells cannot. Keep quiet time in the dark. You follow him along the walk, the slate of sky deepening to a kind velvet. The garden exudes rosemary and damp earth. The cloister's columns unspool like a rosary you can walk. You are a bead moving along a string made of hours. The joke you keep to yourself. You, who never liked group projects, are suddenly content to be one task in a very old to-do list. In the brewery, Martin tucks the ledger into its niche and sets the small bell rope still. He checks the board one last time, adds a dot, just a dot beside Lord's, as if to promise the grist a morning. He presses his palm to the tun's rim, the way you test a sleeping child's forehead. Warm enough to welcome, he murmurs. Then he nods to you, a quiet dismissal wrapped in trust. You'll hear the next instructions when bronze and breath agree. For now, you are timed, you are held, and the tower keeps the watch. You lean your elbows on the tun's rim and ask the question that floats above every glowing fire and piled sack of grain. Why brew at all, and why here? Brother Martin answers by scooping a handful of malt, letting the kernels rain from one palm to the other like a slow hourglass. Because water is born honest and travels badly, he says, and you feel the truth in your throat. Boiling the wort is a kind of blessing with bubbles, scrubbing away the stray life you don't want and leaving a drink that behaves. Mainstream fact slips in with the steam. In much of medieval Europe, ale and small beer were safer daily drinks than raw surface water, which could carry a traveller's whole itinerary of troubles. The brewing process, with its long boil and ferment, made a household staple you could trust, especially in crowded towns where waste and wells were not on speaking terms. Liquid bread, Martin adds, the phrase worn smooth by centuries of use. You can taste its accuracy on your tongue. Grain turned to warmth, calories made sippable for workers and weary pilgrims. Yeast hides little gifts in the mug, B vitamins and friendly proteins, so a mason can lay another course, and a grandmother can make it to Vespers without listing. This is not a party, it's a pantry with a handle. Light joke 1. You finally found a carb loading plan that your gym app can't scold because technically it's medieval. Your eyes stray to the ledger niche, and Martin follows your gaze. Hospitality, he says simply, tapping the word hospites you saw before. The rule that times their prayers also commands their welcome. The guest is Christ at the door. The monastery is a hospitium for pilgrims, merchants with blisters, scholars with ambitious scrolls, children whose mothers need a moment to ask directions. Bread feeds the hand, ale steadies the voice that asks for it. The gatehouse bench becomes a small clinic, where warmth is prescribed by the cup, and the brewery is the quiet pharmacy, making sure the dose is ready by louds. You picture the bell not just telling brothers to pray, but telling strangers they'll be okay. It is also how we keep the grain from going lonely. Martin continues with a smile. If the harvest is generous, bread can stale before you reach the last loaf. Turn some of the grain to ale, and you store summer in the cellar. A barrel is a season with a cork in it. When the road ices and the garden sulks, a tap turns, and a little July walks out. This is the pantry argument, the one witches and widowers and wise abbots share. Preserve what you can in a form that will come back when you call it. The charity ledger stretches into the village beyond the wall. The monastery's almoner knows faces, remembers whose roof leaked last storm, whose child is learning to carry water without spilling half of it into the earth. He will send a jug along with a loaf, not as tavern swagger, but as calories in a handle. Fast days require tact. There's strong ale for feast and labour, small beer for fasting and fragile bodies. You learn a new tenderness hiding inside routine. The bell schedules mercy. If that sounds tidy, Martin's grin adds a wrinkle. Brewing is also a skill the house can sell without selling its soul. With permissions from lord or town, the monastery's cart might rumble to market with casks under canvas, and a brother who can do sums even while the mule argues. Neighbouring households bring coin. The coin keeps vellum on desks and shoes on novices who haven't yet learned where puddles wait. The economy hums softly, and the bell counts the measures like a cashier with perfect pitch. You hear another mainstream echo. In parts of medieval England, authorities issued the assize of bread and ale to regulate price, quality and measure, proof that drink was as daily as bread and needed rules as firm as crust. Quirky tidbit floats in on market air. Some towns employed ale conners, officials who tested the drink. One London legend says they wore leather breeches and would pour ale on a bench, then sit. If their pants stuck when they stood, the sugar levels were right. If they didn't stick well, somebody watered the brew, and the conner had dry breeches and a new enemy. You imagine Brother Martin's face at such theatrics and decide you'd pay admission for that expression alone. He raises a brow as if he's heard the story too, and files it politely in the drawer marked Peculiar Civic Customs. Vision and descriptorly, your finger follows the chalk scrawl that represents the poor, and you picture the gate on a cold morning. Steam from the porter's bowl of porridge, steam from a jug of small beer shared with hands that shake. The drink is gentle, made for thirst and not for rowdy songs, and its warmth travels farther than the cup. In your ear, the building whispers that this routine matters more than headlines. No one will write a saga about small beer handed to a tired grandmother, but the bell will remember her. There's also the belly to consider. Modern asides creep in because your stomach, bless it, is a modern creature with medieval cravings. A day of fieldwork or copying glosses into the margins of Augustine is different work, but both need steady fuel. The brothers brew grades of strength like a spectrum of sunlight. No one hands the novice the festival brew to carry roof tiles, unless the roof is the ground by noon. You learn the simple school of ale math. A stronger batch warms long, a weaker batch refreshes often. The kitchen and brewery gossip like old friends through the hatch, swapping buckets and advice. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly avoided water entirely, or whether they drank it when it was clean and ale when it was wise. The neat myth of no one ever drank water dissolves a little under close light. You stand happily in the nuanced middle. The wellspring has its place, the mug has its day, and the bell knows which is which. Don't forget the calendar, Martin says, pointing at the fish-marked sack again. Fasts come like weather in this world, and brewing bends to them. On days when meat steps off the table and humility sits down, the cup's strength follows suit. The abbot's hand is steady over the measures. Not all restraint looks like an empty plate. You imagine the refectory's hush, the splash of ale gentle as a bow. Jokes are softer then, the kind that borrow their humour from breathing. Light joke too. Your modern fast lasted 14 minutes once, but who's counting besides the bell in your phone that announced snack o'clock? You can't ignore the community's immune system either. Boiled fermented drink lowers risk in a time when gastrointestinal adventure isn't a line you want on your pilgrimage journal. The porter at the gate hands more than a cup. He hands reassurance, a tiny insurance policy against the chaos of roads and rumours. The brewery is public health with a hymn book. The cat approves this message from her sack throne with a blink that says she, too, is an essential worker. There's one more reason, and it lives inside the prayer you keep hearing down the corridor. Work is a way to pray when your mouth is busy. Hands stirring a mash can think kindly. A back bent over casks can repent of sharp words without needing to invent a speech. Ora et labora pray, and work makes heat and hymn rhyme in the same room. You watch Martin check the ton's fittings by touch, a rosary recited with knuckles. In your own life, you've met tasks that become meditations, folding laundry until corners match, chopping vegetables until the board glows damp, and now you get to add keeping yeast happy to the list. Light joke 3. You've never felt so protective of a microorganism you can't see. And yes, you will absolutely text friends later that your night was ferment-rich. All the reasons braid together. Safety, charity, calories, economy, calendar, prayer. The bell ties the braid and keeps it neat. You exhale into the humid calm and taste barley ghosting the air. Martin sets down the scoop, brushes his hands, and glances toward the door where the chant will end soon. We brew, he says finally, because it is one of the ways we tell the world it is not alone. The tune answers with a soft creak, the old wood's contented sigh. You put your palm to the rim and let the warmth come through, a small sun in a copper sky, and your reasons settle the way steam does, slow and everywhere. A hand-lettered tag on the nearest sack reads Audium Barley, and you realize the room has been politely hinting for an hour that you should lift something. Brother Martin shows you how to shoulder the weight without turning your spine into a question mark. One knee under, hug the belly of the sack like an old friend you're slightly afraid of, and rise with the bell's beat still thrumming in your ribs. You take a breath that tastes like breakfast and barns. Dust blooms in the slanted lamplight, floating motes that move so slowly you feel time slip its shoes off. The mill room waits, like a quiet neighbour you were aware of it before you met. The quern stands there, low and round, a granite moon with a wooden handle, and beside it a more serious contraption, a water-driven mill that wakes when the sluice is opened, and the rills whisper upgrades to a chuckle. Tonight you start with the hand quern for a small fraction of the grist, because Martin wants you to hear the song up close before the bigger wheel hums. He palms a handful of malted barley, the kernels pale as straw-yellow pearls, and lets them chime into the hopper. You plant your feet and push. The top stone turns. The sound starts as a murmur and becomes a purr. The rhythm of vespers you can still feel under the floorboards. Mainstream fact keeps time with your wrists. Monastic communities across medieval Europe used mills of many kinds, hand querns for small tasks, horse or ox mills for bulk, and, where water cooperated, water mills that did in an hour what a row of novices could not do before Compline. The growth of water mills from the early Middle Ages onward was so dramatic, some historians call it a quiet technological revolution, a river-powered heartbeat in the economy. You feel very modern doing very old work, and your elbows file a formal complaint to HR. Light joke 1. Your HR department replies that the only benefit package offered tonight is smells great, includes cat. Grain breathes differently once cracked. The husk separates and carries aroma out like a messenger. Martin tests a pinch between his fingers, making sure the crush is right husks, mostly intact to act as a natural filter later. The starchy endosperm broken open to surrender its sweetness to water. He shows you the difference between flour too, fine, a stuck mash waiting to happen, and grist, just right, a Goldilocks crumble. He nods approval at your first attempt in the way teachers do when they've rescued 1,000 beginners, but still let each one think they invented competence. Open the gate, he says, and you pull a lever on the wall. Outside, the narrow rill of water that lined the cloister earlier now diverts into a brief sprint, and the small water wheel begins to turn with an amiable shush. Gears whisper awake. The millstones above you kiss and separate in exactly the distance a careful hand set this morning. Grain pours from a chute, and the room gets its weather. A barley flurry that coats your sleeves like first snow. You look like a pastry you strongly consider eating. Light joke 2. You would caption the selfie, powdered monk, but the rule's subtle glare stops you. Quirky tidbit lands with the dust. In some houses, the miller wore a distinctive hood or cap, not because he was fashion-forward, but because grain dust clings to everything like an affectionate ghost, and a signature cap made it clear to the abbot who had been in the mill when the sneezing started in choir. Dust is not just untidy, it can be dangerous in clouds around sparks. A fact monks learned from the same patient teacher as blacksmith's experience whispered through singed eyebrows. Here, the fire sits far enough that the mill can daydream safely, and Martin's damp sweep keeps dust from plotting. The chalked circles from the brewery slate live again here, in motion instead of on a board. With each quarter turn of the wheel, the grist bin fills to a mark scratched by a previous season's hand. With each soft clack of wooden gear teeth, your shoulders accept that this rhythm knows more about timing than your calendar app. You listen hard and realize how much the room is listening back. Millstones tell their tale in texture. A change means a pebble, a damp patch, a careless handful of unmalted barley slipped in by a sleepy novice. You feel weirdly protective of two rocks grinding together. Light joke 3. If anyone asks, yes, you have adopted a millstone. No, you will not be taking it to the vet. Historians still argue whether monks were the main drivers of milling technology or simply excellent adopters with good record keeping. One camp points to monastic charters bristling with water rights and mill rents. Another notes that lay estates also ran ambitious mill complexes, and that innovation may have flowed upstream and down between cloister and village. You rest in not needing a crown for credit. The wheel turns either way, and tonight you turn with it. Brother Martin shows you how to listen with your fingertips, sliding a palm into the stream of crushed grain. Feel that? He asks. You do. A sandy crumble with the occasional whole kernel snapping like a tiny knuckle. He adjusts the runner stone a feather's width, and the texture shifts from beech to sugar. He grins. Good for lauter, he says, meaning the later stage when wort will be strained off the spent grain, the husks making a filter bed that clarifies the sweetness before the boil. You nod, as if you were already planning to think of that later. A narrow window cuts a diagonal of blue dusk across the room, and dust turns it into a visible beam you could almost lean on. In it, you see tiny hulls drifting like moths. The cat appears on the sill, of course she does, nose twitching, tail writing her opinions on the air. She looks at you with the professional appraisal of a foreman, and turns her head toward the sack you left open, very casually, as if to say, "This is how we get mice. This is also how we keep me interested." You tie the mouth with a practiced twist, and she rewards you with a blink so slow, it qualifies as a blessing. Martin pulls a wooden drawer from beneath the bedstone and shows you the tools. A rind, the iron that supports the upper stone, a small wedge for lifting, a brush for cleaning away the stubborn ghosts of grinds past. He names them like friends. The mill has moods. Today, it hums like a psalm, but on damp mornings it sulks, and on very cold nights, the oil in the bearings hides under a blanket and refuses to flow. He teaches you the gesture for stone slow from the silent sign lexicon, 2 hands circling lazily, and you try it out. Your wrists making quiet circles in the grain-scented air. You carry a fresh sack in, marked with the fish you've been seeing everywhere today. The shorthand for fast day brewing. This malt is kilned lighter, because the ale it becomes will be a gentle companion at table, a soft sip rather than a boast. You slice it open, and the very colour is modest, a pale gold that gets shy near lamplight. The mill takes it with the same calm appetite, grinding humility and barley at equal speed. Martin's voice thins to a thread as he tells you a story of a flood years back that drowned the sluice and silenced the wheel for a season. The brothers and the village carried sacks together in a chain of hands to a mill 3 fields away. We learned then, he says, that even when the bell calls, water has the last word. The room settles around the memory, and you understand another homily the stones could preach. Resilience is often a handful at a time. Your sleeves now look like a map of pale countries. Your eyelashes have learned to wear barley in a way your vanity does not approve. You swipe your face and taste sweet dust at the corner of your mouth. The next sack waits, and you shoulder it with the confidence of someone who has internalized one very old lesson. Back straight, breath steady, lift with intention. You deliver it to the hopper like an offering grain repurposed into fuel for song, labour, and the kind of laughter that doesn't need to be loud to last. When the bin reaches its chalked tally, Martin shuts the gate. The wheel coasts, slows, and stops with a satisfied rattle. The silence that follows isn't empty. It's like the quiet after a well-told story. You brush the stone with gentle strokes, the way you'd brush crumbs from a sleeping child's blanket. The room exhales, and dust settles back into being part of the floor. You take one last palmful of grist and let it flow through your fingers. It falls like a small hour you helped pass wisely. Outside, the bell sighs a thin note for Complin's end, and the brewery answers with a glow you can feel even with your eyes closed. The night grows wise around the walls. You've partnered with rocks, water, and time, and somehow you are less awake than when you started. The mill's lullaby lingers in your bones, and tomorrow's mash already knows your name. The tun greets you like a bath that swears it's a church. Wood dark from 1,000 steeps, iron hoops holding a belly that knows more about patience than you do about weekends. Brother Martin sets a ladder and climbs as if ascending a modest psalter, then offers you the mash paddle, oar, staff, and lullaby wand in one, and you accept like a knight receiving a spoon. The bell barely lifts a note for the night watch. Matines isn't far. Your task is simple and enormous. Marry hot water to shattered grain at temperatures a monk measures with a finger and a frown. You open the slatted false bottom, the lauter floor, making sure the bed will later drain like polite rain through reeds. Martin runs his palm around the stave seams, listening for a leak with his skin. Satisfied, he draws the first water from the kettle. Not a boil, but a shimmer, the surface busy with small thoughts. Steam climbs and writes a psalter in the rafters. "Strike water," he says, and the words feel like they belong to blacksmiths and brewers equally. You pour in a slow ribbon, and the tun exhales, wood drinking heat, grain waiting like a choir on tiptoe. Grain goes next. Grist from your evening at the mill, pale and perfect. You scatter it in like a farmer blessing a field, and the surface clots to porridge. The paddle bites. You stir, trying to keep your shoulders from sulking, trying to fold in dry islands before they harden to stubborn continents. Mainstream fact glides in with the scent. Infusion, mashing, steeping crushed malt in hot water to convert starches to sugars through enzymes was the backbone of ale-making in much of medieval northern Europe, where direct-fired mash tuns were rare and hot stones or step infusions did the work. The goal is a temperature sweet spot where amylases sing. You don't need to name the enzymes, you just need to keep them happy. And for once in your life, the way to keep someone happy is to stir. "Slow circles," Martin says, as if you're convincing a friend. He taps the rim at compass, points north, east, south, west, an old habit that ensures no corner sulks. The mash thickens and loosens with each pass, and your paddle begins to feel less like a plank and more like a long wooden sentence you're almost done writing. Light joke 1. Congratulations. You are finally using your core strength for something other than opening stubborn jam jars. You check temperature the monastery way. Martin dips a clean finger, waits the length of a Kyrie, and lifts it with a small hiss, satisfied. He has a floating stick thermometer in a box somewhere, a later century gift, but tonight the house prefers the older liturgy of touch, smell, and steam. He shows you the trick of leaning over the tun and breathing in through your nose, mouth open, to catch the sweetness without scalding curiosity. It smells like warm bread, telling jokes it stole from honey. "Rest," he says, and you let the mash settle, both of you pretending you haven't fallen slightly in love with porridge. The surface shines, tiny bubbles like chapel beads. You lay the paddle across the rim like a sword asleep. Matins stirs in the distance, the first small bell passing a note to the dark. The pause is not idleness. It's the quiet where grain rewrites itself starch to sugar, rigid to generous. In the quiet, Martin tells you the tune's biography. Built when the abbey was younger, staves repaired after a frost that humbled a whole county, rehooped with iron when oak tired of holding its breath. The tune is a kind of archivist. It keeps a record in flavour instead of ink. Quirky tidbit rises with the steam. Some brewers of the Old North warmed their mashes with Steinbier stones, igneous rocks heated in the hearth and plunged into the mash, carving caramel scars where they kissed. The stones carried soot memories and gave little smoky toffee notes as a signature. Monasteries with decent kettles rarely needed the drama, but the trick sneaks around the edges of brewing legends like a cousin who tells better stories than he lives. Martin gestures to a basket of smooth river stones near the furnace. "For winter tantrums," he winks, "and for novices who need a reminder that hot things are hot." The cat, sprawling on a sack nearby, flicks an ear as if to say she learned that lesson without stones. Stir again. The paddle's return is a relief and a chore. Your shoulders argue, but the smell bribes them into compliance. You catch and break a couple of dry clumps hiding like teenagers behind a stairwell, and the mash evens to a silky thickness somewhere between oatmeal and ambition. A thin ribbon runs from a sampling spigot into a wooden spoon. Martin holds it up to a candle and watches how it sheets. "Nearly there," he murmurs. He drops a tiny dash of boiled wort on a shard of pottery and smears with his thumb. An old-school iodine test before iodine knew it was invited. He's reading viscosity and shine the way a scribe reads ink on vellum. Historians still argue whether medieval monastic mash schedules were deliberately stepped warming through multiple rests for protein, beta, and alpha amylase, or whether most houses aimed for a single infusion, letting room temperature and vessel mass drift them gently. Records are spare on numbers and rich on verbs, and scholars lean over words like tepid, hot, and very hot, as if they were thermometers. You anchor happily in the ambiguity, trusting hands that learned by nose and bell. Tonight feels like a single, generous rest, with the bell doing the counting and your shoulders keeping time. Another ribbon of hot water snakes in from the kettle. Martin's eye is the thermostat, the bell, the timer. You stir, and the mash brightens, syrup gaining ease. A chant filigrees the edges of the room from the chapel beyond. Steam slips into the nave through a high opening and fogs the chapel glass. And for a moment, saints on painted panes look like they're breathing. You grin at the thought of a stained glass monk smelling like malt and wonder if that counts as incense. Light joke 2. If your parish ever replaces thuribles with mash tuns, attendance will skyrocket among homebrewers and cats. He beckons you to the lauter test. You draw off a small stream, cloudy at first, then clearing to a warm straw. You pour it back over the mash bed in a slow circle Vorlauf, returning the first runnings until they run bright. The word is foreign, but the sense is simple. Invite the grain husks to settle into a filter. Ask the wort to polish itself on their patience. The tun becomes a sleepy lake with reeds that know their job. When the runnings finally gleam in the spoon, Martin nods and sets the spigot to a patient thread. The kind of flow that looks like it will take a week and actually finishes before your jokes do. You watch sugars travel from grain to future. The kettle, waiting, receives the first sweet trickle with a hiss of gratitude. You keep stirring the top, gently, just to keep the bed from sulking. The mash's warmth has become a weather system. Your cheeks glow, your hair decides to misbehave, and your glasses, if you'd worn them, would have surrendered any pretense of clarity. You accept it, the brewery accepts you. The cat evaluates the paddle as a possible chaise, and decides against splinters. While the wort gathers, Martin opens a small sack of herbs. Their lesson is later, but he lets you sniff. Grains of paradise wink like peppery planets. Yarrow smells like a meadow reading poetry to itself, and a few hop cones sit like green folded hands. He closes the bag as reverently as he opened it. A promise more than a tease. First things first, he says, and pats the tune's rim. A little flourish of modernocide sneaks in because your brain keeps making timelines. Long before pale lagers, before glass clarity obsessed anyone's dinner, this porridge and its careful baths were the heart of daily ale. Not a trophy drink, a table one. The point wasn't a brag. It was a blessing you could pour. Light joke 3. If social media had existed, the hashtag would have been number humblewort, and the only filter needed was a husk bed. By now the mash has slumped into that satisfied posture a good stew gets when it knows it is loved. The bell for matins releases into the night, a soft bronze river that lifts the hair on your arms, and the brothers' chant follows. Unhurried, threaded through stone like silk through linen. You hold still with the paddle upright, a small mast in a malt sea, and the sound sets tiny ripples tidying the surface. Martin bows his head. You try it too, without being told. And the steam makes a roof over all of you, the song, the grain, the cat, even the old water stains on the beam that resemble, if you squint, the outline of an abbess who once told the cooper to redo an iffy stave. When the last of the first runnings has filled the kettle to a mark you now recognize as "Trust me," Martin closes the spigot and adds the sparge hot water poured gently to coax the remaining sugars from their cling. Not too hot, or you'll pull harshness. Not too cool, or you'll leave sweetness behind. He pours from a ladle in circles, and you realize this is as much a conversation as it is a technique. How much will you give me if I ask nicely? Quite a lot, it turns out, when you don't rush the asking. The kettle waits, patient predator, for the boil to come. The mash rests again, luxurious as a nap on a day you pretended would be productive. You lay the paddle down and feel how your hands have absorbed the tun's story warmth under skin, a ghost of barley sweetness written into your fingerprints. Outside the brewery door, the night has grown thinner. The Easter rumour. Matins finishes, the last note hovering long enough to find its own echo. The chapel glass clears its fogged breath as if waking from a dream about fields. You cover the tun with its lid, a wooden cap that turns steam back to dew and keeps heat home. Martin presses the edge with his thumb, measuring the snugness. Good, he says, the single word a benediction. He draws the sign for sleep from the silent lexicon, a tilted head on palm, and you wonder if he means you or the mash. Probably both. The work is not loud, but it is large. The bell will move you along when it's time. For now, the porridge thinks, the tune keeps time, and the chapel windows wait for morning to sketch simple light along the floor. The lid lifts, the steam breathes you in, and Brother Martin finally opens the little sack he teased earlier, the one that smells like the edge of a meadow thinking about choir. He pours a palmful into your cupped hands. Yarrow first feathered leaves dried to a green-grey whisper, a nose like cut grass reading Latin under an apple tree. Then bog myrtle sweet gale from the wetlands, resinous and soft, like a pine decided to be polite. A few hop cones, papery and pale, unfurl like folded green bells. You tilt your hands, and the herbs make a tiny, fragrant landslide into the bowl by the kettle. The bell takes a breath above you. The schedule has herbs at none, but the arguments about them have no hour. You've met Gruit, Martin says, and your mouth shapes the word as if it were a nut that needs a second bite. Gruit is a blend, not a single plant, a custom basket of herbs this region trusts to steady sweetness and nudge bitterness before hops conquer the map. Mainstream fact arrives with the scent. For centuries in parts of medieval Europe, especially the Low Countries, and the Rhineland brewers flavoured and preserved ale with mixes of herbs, yarrow, bog myrtle, sweet gale, rosemary, juniper, and their seasonal friends. Hops were known, but not yet sovereign. Only later did hopped beer move from novelty to norm, reshaping taste and trade. You let yarrow's bright, almost tea-like edge sit on your tongue, and the tongue's soft sweetness braces itself for company. The herb chest has little drawers labelled in an ink that survived winters you would not. Martin slides one out to show you alecost, costmary, bitter, minty, and lemon soft. A leaf with a nickname, Bible leaf. Quirky tidbit. Monastic readers tucked it into pages and nibbled it during long lessons, both as a bookmark and as a breath freshener that, allegedly, prevented dozing in theological traffic. You lift a leaf to your nose and feel your sinuses sit up straighter. Somewhere, a novice postpones a nap by 15 minutes and calls it virtue. Light joke 1. The modern equivalent is chewing gum that says, extra focus, except your gum never knew Latin or the Psalms. Another brother arrives, sleeves rolled, eyebrows already in debate. Hops, he declares, as if greeting a guest who always pays for dinner. Martin smiles a peacemaker's smile and sprinkles a pinch of yarrow as if to say, not so fast. The kettle's first murmurs of heat drift up, and you realise you've walked into a long-running conversation with many chapters. The hop advocate taps the cone as if it were a small bell. They keep, he insists. Hops lend bitterness, yes. But their real gift for a monastery planning alms and markets is time. They slow spoilage, carry flavour over roads that have opinions. Mainstream fact's other hand lifts. Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century abbess, composer, herbalist with a talent for adjectives, wrote that hops make the soul of the drinker feel cheerful and, more practically, that they keep beer from spoiling, retarding putrefaction. When an abbess tells Europe a plant makes ale last, Europe listens, albeit on medieval delay. By the 14th and 15th centuries, hopped beer from the north rides trade routes into towns that used to only know Gruit and the words beer. Hopped and ale, unhopped, show up in English records playing tug of war until the rope phrase and the categories mingle. You imagine a bell tower somewhere getting a tiny new job, ringing in shipments from Bremen. The two brothers stage a polite duel over your nose. Martin wafts yarrow, sweet gale, and a breath of rosemary across the rim of your mug. The other brother cracks a hop cone with his thumb and releases lupulin like tiny golden stars. The smells braid and unbraid. Meadow, marsh, green bitterness like the afterword of lettuce. Gruit gives layers, Martin says. Seasons in a sip. Hop brother grins. Hops give a clean line. You can taste where the brew starts and where it finishes. You don't say it out loud, but both arguments make your mouth happy. Light joke 2. You are in dangerous diplomatic territory, and will hereby represent the embassy of yes please. You watch their hands as much as their mouths. Timing matters. Gruit herbs, softer and diverse, often join the party earlier or later, depending on what they offer, bitter or aromatic, while hops, with their precise punch, like structured additions, bittering early, flavour midway, aroma late, each rung measured by bell or sand glass. Martin flicks his eyes to the tower. The hop brother has already turned the hourglass. In this house, debate never stops the clock. You crack a yarrow stem between your fingers and smell a little chamomile ghost you didn't expect. Historians still argue whether Gruit was primarily a flavour practice, managed by local tradition, or a licensed monopoly, a revenue scheme controlled by lords, bishops, or town councils who sold Gruit rights and guarded recipes like treasure. Records whisper about Gruit rights and taxes, but the exact contents of each blend hide behind words like herbs, as if scribes were protecting family soup secrets. Some scholars say power clung to the herb baskets until hops democratized bitterness. Others reply that hops simply rode a wider tide of trade and taste, not a rebellion, but an evolution. You breathe in diplomacy and steam, and decide your job is to stir loyally and let the archivist wrestle with footnotes. The kettle begins its prelude, little fisheye bubbles along the edge, and the herb choreography starts. Martin pinches bog myrtle between finger and thumb, crushing resin to wake it up, and lets it drift into the rising heat. The hop brother contributes a modest early handful. This house is easing toward hops without burning, the old recipe book, and the aroma lifts, a tethered balloon. You can see why markets fell for the clean, repeatable bitterness hops deliver. You can also see why a monastery with a marsh at its elbow wouldn't abandon the plants that know its weather. A side drawer gives up a fist of juniper twigs, tiny green pins of forest. Not tonight, Martin says with a glance, but another batch will want that brisk cup of woods note. He points to dried orange peel a traveller paid with at the gate, an exotic grace note saved for feast brew. Your nose travels farther than your feet around this room. Geography gets crushed and steeped and turned into warmth. Light joke 3. You add portable cartography by sniffing to your resume under skills. Right below cat diplomacy and advanced stirring. You get a tutorial in restraint. With gruit, more isn't better. It's louder. Bog myrtle too bold can turn medicinal. Yarrow too much leans toward cough drop country. Hops too hard and too early can bully the grain into sulking. Martin's face is a sermon on balance. He lets you measure a late yarrow, sprinkle the perfumey kind that kisses the nose, but leaves the tongue mostly alone, and you feel a ridiculous, tender pride when he doesn't correct your pinch. The cat, who approves of all measured gestures that end in warmth, settles under the herb chest like a green apothecary's footman. Trade-made taste travel, Hop Brother says, rolling a cone between forefinger and thumb until its size yellow. Hanseatic cogs, stout ships of northern merchants, carried hops in bales that smelled like tidy gardens, and towns learned to expect their beer to taste the same in January as in June. Groot loved local, hops scaled. The bell does not care which you prefer, but the ledger cares whether the cask you set aside for market returns as coin or complaint. You picture the ale conner from earlier sticky breeches or not developing a new trick, sniffing for hops stamp like a customs agent for bitterness. The kettle tips from simmer to boil, a soft roaring that feels like a blanket rather than a trumpet. Early additions go in with a rain of small green paper bells, then a pause to let the bitterness settle into the wort's sweetness, like a firm handshake. Later, a smaller bouquet late gruit for aroma slips in, the yarrow rising like a quiet hymn over the deeper note hops have laid down. The bell slices a thin note through the rafters, the hourglass neck thins, and you pour the final handful, as if seasoning a soup you've worked on for hours, which you realize you have. Steam braids your hair in a style you did not ask for but will wear with monkish confidence. A last drawer holds hop binds, dried not for the kettle, but for pillows. Another quirky aside you love. People once stuffed hops into cushions to encourage sleep. Their oil's allegedly a lullaby. Martin pinches a crumble and smirks. If tonight's boil doesn't already do that, he says, the pillow will finish the sermon. You imagine the dormitory smelling faintly of green gardens, the snoring ensemble performing in the key of cask. You accept the possibility of being asleep before dawn lectures you about responsibility. The debate settles not with victory, but with tea. A cup is drawn a quick brewer's tea, from a small ladleful of boiling wort poured over a pinch of tonight's herbs. You blow, you sip, and the flavour box opens. Grain first, then hops firm line, then yarrow's meadow note, bog myrtle's soft resin. It is balanced the way a bell is balanced. Heavy where it must be, musical where it can be. Martin nods once, a verdict. Hop Brother shrugs in a way that means, fine, but next time my early edition is bigger. You grin at how monasteries fight wars you can drink. If you listen closely, the argument continues in quieter registers, in the ledgers, in which batches travel best, in which casks the porter empties first on cold mornings, in which faces smile at the gate. The world around these walls is changing a slow turn of trade winds, a language of bitterness evolving, and the house changes with it the way stones weather, a millimetre at a time, with pride left at the threshold. The bell agrees. It calls you not to choose a side for all time, but to pour this batch well, write it down, and listen to tomorrow with the same nose. Steam thins, the hourglass empties, and the herbs you measured become a memory inside a larger warmth. The tun and kettle keep their own diaries in aromas you won't smell again until you've earned them. You rest the cone's crumpled paper skin on the bench, lime green gone to parchment. The cat curls into it like a princeling on a boat. You stroke her head and think, privately and sleepily, that you have never cared so much about plants you cannot eat directly. The bell touches the air, the debate dissolves into the clatter of hooks and the soft mutter of boiling sugar, and the room goes back to its old vocation, making time gentle, one fragrant argument at a time. You brace the peel against the hearth and feed the fire like a courteous dragon keeper. Small dry sticks for eagerness, thicker billets for endurance, a wedge of split oak that smells faintly of last summer's thunderstorm. The kettle shoulders into a fuller voice, the rim jittering with a necklace of pin bubbles that swear innocence, even as they plot mischief. Brother Martin tips the hourglass, the bell takes a tiny practice breath overhead, and you feel how this room treats boiling like a liturgy. There will be a call, a response, a procession of additions, and a recessional, where everyone leaves with eyebrows intact. The first surge arrives in a hurry, a pale foam climbing the copper like ambitious lace. You learn the brewer's calm panic, a long-handled rake under the white cap to fold it back, a whispered, easy as if steam understands words, a damp cloth on the handle because copper tells the truth about heat. Mainstream fact beams bright through the steam. Copper kettles were prized across much of medieval and early modern Europe for their even heat and practical magic. Copper ions help suppress some unwanted microbes, and a strong boil does two quiet miracles at once. Sanitizes the wort and drives off volatiles you don't want lingering, including the cabbagey whispers of dimethyl sulfide. You skim the early froth, the hot break, proteins clumping and drifting, and feel like you're tidying a lake for a saint's reflection. A stick lies across the kettle's mouth, not superstition but physics. Breaking the surface calms the climb. Martin calls it the boil staff, no Latin, just a tool with authority. He shows you how to tilt it so big bubbles split and reconsider their life choices. Light joke 1. You wish a single wooden stick could also prevent your inbox from boiling over. Alas, the rule of email remains unwritten. A loop of twine dangles from a beam above a quick snare for the kettle lid, in case the fire needs tempering faster than hands can arrange. Every gesture tonight is a memo from someone else's good or bad day. You ride the kettle's moods by sound. A proper rolling boil has a voice like a low crowd. At a good game, steady, round, no shrieking. If it hisses too thin, it's flirting with simmer. If it roars like wrath, you're wasting fuel and scaring the cat. The hourglass sheds minutes like amber rain. Martin flicks his eyes to the bell rope. One tug will mark the quarter, the cue for the next edition. When the note comes, you answer with a measured rain of hops. A few of your late gruit leaves, and the smell leaps a fence you didn't realize was there. Bitterness lays its line, sweetness nods, and steam writes fan letters to the rafters. You stand still long enough to notice copper's freckles heat tint here, a tiny repair there where the cooper and the smith once were friends. Quirky tidbit steps up. Some brew houses embedded a witch peg or blessing nail in the kettle's rim, a sliver of iron marked with a cross or saint's sigil, half benediction, half early quality control. If the wort turned spiteful, at least they could say they'd asked for help. Martin taps a small iron rivet with a fingertip, not to conjure anything, just to thank the hands that kept this vessel honest. The boil's middle is both work and waiting. You shovel coals, you skim the occasional rag of foam, you listen for tiny cues, the pitch of the bubble changing when a log collapses, the soft slap against the kettle's belly when the wort thickens. Mainstream truth leans in again. Vigorous boiling helps coagulate proteins that hot break you skim, improves clarity down the road, and paired with your careful hop timing, shapes bitterness that will taste like intention rather than accident. A bell stroke, another addition, and you realize you've started to trust bronze the way sailors trust wind. Historians still argue whether medieval boils ran as long and as consistently as later recipes prescribe an hour, 2, more, or whether fuel cost, kettle size, and regional habits shortened the dance. Records say, boil well, and until it be enough, which is either unhelpful or gracious, depending on your mood. Some accounts praise long wort for sturdier keeping. Others hint that economy clipped minutes wherever yeast would forgive. You watch Martin's face more than the glass. His brow knows when enough has arrived, the way a grandmother knows when soup is ready without ever using a clock. The kettle takes a breath, and you catch a whiff of malt candy where the boil licks the rim. You ask the dangerous question about scorch. He twitches a grin. We listen is the whole answer. Even heat, constant movement, no lazy corners. He shows you the stir of safety, a slow circle around the kettle's wall where sugars like to settle, and your arm learns the path like a pilgrim's feet, learning ruts on a familiar lane. Light joke 2. You now have exactly one dance move, and it's called Prevent Caramel Anxiety. The fire demands ethics and technique. Too greedy a flame, and the boil leaps like a show-off. Too timid, and you're telling the wort bedtime stories when it needs a bracing speech. A leather bucket of water squats by the hearth because accidents were invented early. A hearth rake waits like a halberd to pull logs away in a blink. Martin says nothing about danger because the room already said it. You pay attention because eyebrows grow slowly. Around you, the floor's burn scars teach history in the tense that matters most. Don't. Between additions, he salts the boil with a single clean pebble, the kind you used earlier for winter tantrums. It rattles the bottom in a tiny circle, a trick to keep nucleation sites lively and boilovers shy. Quirky aside, some brewers swore by hanging a horseshoe at the hearth. Luck, iron, who knows, but this house believes in pebbles and vigilance. You believe in whatever keeps the foam modest. Another bell stroke, and the late bouquet enters a hush-quiet pinch that will travel to the nose more than the tongue. You discover how hard it is to be careful when you're tired. Your pinch wobbles generous, and Martin catches your wrist with a kindness that never feels like scolding. He has the patience of someone who has rescued dozens of near overpours. He adjusts the measure, and your embarrassment evaporates in the steam before it can curdle. The cat reappears like a ritual, inhaling the hop's green breath and pretending indifference. She takes up her post atop the herb chest, tail flicking at each bell stroke as if she, too, runs the schedule. You wonder how many boil-overs she has witnessed and whether she keeps a mental scorecard. Light joke 3. If she had thumbs, she would write a manual called Humans, a field guide to preventable foam. Mainstream fact, one more. While ale houses and brew houses often shared methods, monasteries wrote them down more faithfully, ledgers tallying fuel, hops, and time sitting inches from prayers for rain and peace. So, later readers glimpse rhythms like tonight's not because nobody else brewed, but because monks saved their receipts. This is why your hands now echo someone's notes from 200 winters ago. At the bell of none, bitter. At the bell of vespers, perfume. Draw off at Complin's end. The hourglass thins, the boil settles from declaration to conversation. Martin draws a spoonful and blows until the surface tightens like lacquer. He sips, eyes on the middle distance where brewers see their future casks. Clean, he says, firm. He points you toward the coolship room with a tilt of his head. You lift the latch to peek. Shallow tinned pans sleep there, the night air already moving in slow, important rivers. You'll meet them in a moment, but the kettle still holds the floor. Historians still argue about kettles themselves, how widespread large copper vessels were versus iron or even fired clay in poorer houses, whether itinerant smiths kept abbeys in good repair, or whether wealthier foundations hoarded metallurgical talent. Some say copper crowned every great house's hearth. Others remind us that repairs and substitutions tell their own stories of scarcity. You touch the riveted seam of your kettle and whisper a thank you to donors who preferred equipment to stained glass. Without them, this room would be inventing Steinbier more often than it wished. The last minute arrives with a bell, and you raise the staff for one more foam-taming pass. The fire is banked, not smothered. The boil recedes with the dignity of a bishop recessing down the nave. Martin wedges the lid askew, a little door for steam to leave on friendly terms, then waits the quiet count of 50 before nodding. Off, he says, and together you lever the kettle's mouth toward a waiting trough that will lead the wort to its bed of night air. It falls in a caramel ribbon that makes a sound you will dream about like silk, whispering secrets to wood. You stand down the fire with practiced courtesies, coals spread thin, embers pinned, a wet cloth scold for a stray spark, and the hearth relaxes its shoulders. The room cools in increments you can count on your skin. Somewhere, Complin has tipped into sleep. The dormitory breathes in a gentle chord. The kettle's belly ticks as metal forgets heat. Your hands smell like bitter and bread, and some not small part of you will measure future nights by this scent like a private calendar. The bell does not ring for applause, and the ledger will give this boil a single neat line. But your bones know you've taken part in the old choreography. Heat, foam, timing, restraint. On a map, you're still inside 4 stone walls. In your chest, you've moved a long way into a craft someone could trust enough to drink with their children at table and their grandmothers by the gate. The next room waits with open windows and patient pans. You tip your face into the gentler air and follow the wort toward its cool, listening for the night to take up the song the fire has set down. You follow the caramel ribbon into the cooler room, where the air moves like a careful choir, not loud, just everywhere at once. Shallow pans wait broad, tinned, and calm like placid ponds someone carried indoors. Brother Martin hands you a wooden rake with a flat blade. Thin and wide, he says, and you coax the new wort into a lake so shallow even starlight could wade without getting its hem wet. Heat climbs off it in sighs. The room replies with tender draughts pulled through shutters high under the rafters. You hear the last small arguments of the kettle die behind you, and the silence here is not empty. It's purposeful, as if the room is saying, "Let me hold this for a while." Mainstream fact walks in with the breeze. Long before copper coils and mechanical chillers, brewers cooled wort in broad, shallow vessels. Coolships because surface area is the friend of quick cooling. In later centuries, the word becomes famous in the lambic houses of the Sene Valley, where the night air gifts wild yeasts to open pans, but the basic idea is older and practical. Get the heat out before the wort invites the wrong guests. Your rake draws the surface like you're combing a giant's hair after a windy prayer. Martin lifts 2 shutters a hand's width, then another pair a hand less, playing the louvers like an instrument to tune the cross breeze. He pinches a candle flame and watches how the smoke leans. The draft is steady, not drafty. Important difference there to carry heat, not dust. A fine linen hangs over each opening like a veil. Ash white, fresh from a boiling and a beating on the laundry stone. Quirky tidbit hangs with it. Some houses scented these linens faintly with rosemary or lavender from the herb garden, not to season the ale, but because those oils turn flies into atheists. You breathe and catch a ghost of Rosemary's polite spine. The cat, arriving like an understudy who knows all the lines, approves from a beam with a blink that says she would, as always, have eaten the flies anyway. You carry a small pitcher and make a patient circuit, topping a corner here, trimming a swell there, turning a pond into a plate. That thinness is the point. Less depth, less time for mischief. The wort is sweet, almost courting, the kind of fragrance that invites every wrong sort of microorganism to think it can start a band in your pan. Your job is to be the bouncer with a rake and a breeze. Light joke 1. You have never felt so much like nightclub security for sugar water. Your guest list is heat out, dust never, yeasts please wait your turn. A rack near the wall holds broom heads of birch twigs stripped and bound, their ends softened by use. Martin swishes one gently across the surface of a pan, gathering the last protein rafts that escaped your boil skimming. They cling like little clouds to the twigs, and he knocks them off into a crock with a pleasant, domestic finality. He calls the tool a tussock, which sounds like something you'd nap on, and perhaps is, after the shift. You try the motion and discover it's less a sweep than a caress. The wort looks clearer, like a polished window you weren't sure was dirty. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers cooled in open lofts like this everywhere, or only in houses lucky with climate and stone, while others built smaller batch sizes to make cooling bankers quick in thick-walled rooms. Some point to engravings and accounts of pans under eaves. Others remind us of hillside cellars and courtyard troughs. The records keep their polite vagueness spread to cool, lay forth, and scholars make maps from verbs. You choose to enjoy the way tonight's map smells, and let footnotes keep each other company till morning. The rake's wooden edge hums against pan tin low, content. Martin shows you another trick. Lay a thin plank across the pan's width, dip a cloth into the hot wort, wring, drape it back over the plank, and let evaporation drink the heat from the cloth, which drinks it from the wort. Evaporative sympathy, medieval edition. A tiny breeze skims the wet cloth, and you can feel the temperature nudge down a cousin's degree. Compared to your old life's gadgets, it's tender, nearly shy, and it works anyway. He points to slits cut high in the gable, a kind of timbered gill. Warm air rises and slides out. Cooler air slips in and strolls, not sprints. The bell doesn't rule this room. The air does, and Martin's hands translate. He checks the small tie dial scratched on a post, an old mark that says, "In winter lift more, in summer lift less," and adjusts the shutters by a thumb's width. You find yourself nodding with the same gravity people reserve for art galleries and meteorology reports. A memory of your boil's staff leans against the wall, demoted to walking stick for a stroll among pans. You use it to read surface texture. Little wrinkles soften, bigger ones fall asleep. The candle test appears again. Martin lowers a flame to the pan's edge. If heat flutters it from too far away, you give the wort more time to think. If the flame minds its own business, you're drifting into safe territory. Light joke 2. Your new relationship status with candle flames is, It's complicated. We're cooling together, but we're just friends. There's ritual in the cleaning too. Cloths boiled and beaten, pans scoured with sand, then rinsed with a ladle of hot wort, self-sterilizing courtesy. The floor sluiced with hot water while drains whisper. You notice iron nails in the thresholds turn black with old tannins. Someone was fond of sweeping with vigor. On a shelf sits a jar of horsehair fine, resilient, twisted into a filter loop that fits the spigot you'll use later. The cat eyes it, decides it isn't a mouse, and resumes being architecture. Mainstream fact again, because it's comforting. The faster you take wort from cozy to cool enough to pitch, the less time you leave for airborne spoilage organisms to introduce themselves as entrepreneurs. Later centuries call it the danger zone with thermometers. Tonight it's a learned patience that moves sugar from pan to piece. You lean on the rake and swear the air tastes progressively more like bread and less like pudding. Outside, the east is smudging paler lords nearer than you expected. A moth pursues your candle with the optimism of an artist on opening night. You cup the flame, then blow it out and work by moon and habit for a while. Martin produces a small net spider silk fine, though not actually spider silk, and clears a pale gnat whose life choices did not include immortality in ale. You salute the tiny creature with a private eulogy and carry on. Quirky tidbit knocks softly. Some brewers hung horsehair curtains, or even strings of juniper twigs along the top sills, believing the resin scent confused insects and the dangling movement made them reconsider. Between rosemary veils, patient cats, and twigs, the room leans toward keepers rather than killers. You press a palm to a pan's underside and feel almost there. In the language skin knows better than words. Martin lifts a dipping stick marked by notches darkened with pitch. He lowers it into the pan and settles it under his chin, a habit older than the metal, like a violinist reading A minor. He hums a yes. The wort's sheen has shifted from glossy to gentle, and in the corner you see the faintest suggestion of a skin forming at the edges, a sign you're straddling that line between warm and welcoming. Soon you'll ferry this into the fermenters where living things take over the night shift. A breeze turns the linen veil into a slight bow. Rosemary kisses the air again. You think about last hour's herb debate and smile at how many plants get to speak in one drink, some in the boil, some in the breeze, some only in the room's memory. The cat makes a slow circuit over the beam and chooses a spot directly above the pan you're most proud of, either as benediction or as a test of your composure. Light joke 3. You negotiate silently. She promises not to shed. You promise not to breathe loudly. Historians still argue whether medieval cooling rooms like this invited more spontaneous inoculation than later. Monastic records admit did God is good, that charming English name for balm, sometimes arrive on the night wind. Or did houses guard favoured yeast so carefully that open pans were simply a cooling step, not a yeast hunt? One camp reads romance into the rafters. Another points to practical reuse of balm from yesterday's ferment, or even from a neighbour's good batch. Your answer tonight is obedience. Cool swiftly, cover thoughtfully, and carry the wort to the yeast you trust when the bell nods. Martin shows you how the linen veil lowers over the pans, a loose canopy that lets air flow, but lectures dust into staying outside. He lifts one corner and you lean under. The world becomes a pale tent, steam making a light fog, rosemary and malt talking in a language you could sleep inside. He lets it fall and ties the corners with a lazy knot. Not tight, just sufficient the monastery's design language. By the time the last pan stops smoking and simply breathes, the tower gives Louds a silvered prelude. It's morning, technically. Your eyes have been drifting toward that idea for an hour without committing. Martin taps 2 fingers on the pan, rim cool enough then on your wrist, so are you. He points toward the fermenting room, where crocks and tons wait with clean mouths and quiet patience. Soon you'll pitch the balm and listen to crocks whisper alive. For now, the coolship holds its glassy thought, and the room has done what rooms dream of doing. Kept something precious, safe, by being calm. You set your rake on its peg, exactly where someone will expect to find it in 3 centuries, because habits are time machines. The cat descends the post like a practiced acrobat and brushes your leg with a tail that smells faintly of warm wood. The veil swells once more with a tiny breeze and subsides like a sleeping lung. You breathe with it slow, long, enough, and leave the night air to finish its sermon while you go meet the congregation of crocs. The fermenting room is quieter than the chapel, which is saying something, because the chapel knows how to keep a secret. Rows of crocks and tons stand like patient monks with open mouths, staves clean, hoops honest, lids leaning close by like hats set aside for prayer. A cool hush holds the corners. A faint prickle in your nose tells you the room already knows the word for carbon dioxide, even if no one writes it down. Brother Martin taps a rim the way a choirmaster taps a music stand. "Ready to listen?" he asks. "You are. You have been all night. You've brought the wort here in steady pails. A procession without incense, but with excellent posture. Each ladleful is a ribbon of amber that becomes a small pond, then a deeper one. You watch steam leave like a congregation after mass, gentle, chatty. Then, suddenly, gone. A linen cover, scalded and wrung, waits over each vessel's mouth. Tonight it will be the thinnest of doors, keeping the wrong travellers out while the invited ones multiply into a chorus. Martin lifts a croc's veil and nods toward a wooden bowl that looks plain until you notice it's old the way oaks are old. Inside sleeps a straw gold froth, glossy as morning yolk. "Balm," he says, the word round and affectionate. "This is yesterday's gift, skimmed from a batch that sang in tune, kept cool and fed with a little sweet wort so it wouldn't get lonely. Mainstream fact warms your palms. Medieval brewers commonly pitched fresh wort, with balm foam skimmed from an active ferment, reusing yeast from batch to batch long before anyone could spell Saccharomyces. In England, the starter was sometimes nicknamed God is good, a cheerful statement and a house policy in one. The bowl wakes as soon as it smells the new sugars. Little blips of life pop at the surface like tiny prayer bubbles, and you feel a ridiculous tenderness for organisms so small you could fit 1,000,000 on your fingernail and still have room for a crumb of yarrow. Light joke 1. Congratulations, you have become a helicopter parent to yeast. Somewhere your phone wants to send push notifications that read, "Bubbles achieved. You're doing amazing, sweetie." You watch Martin proof the balm in the monastery way. A ladle of tonight's wort warms the starter. He stirs with a birch twig whisk until the gloss brightens, and a faint hiss answers his hand. The sound is less than a whisper and more than a thought. The cat materializes in the doorway, sniffs, and gives you a look that says, very clearly, "This is the important part. Try not to narrate it too loudly." He shows you the pitching measure. Not too much, or you risk a riot in the crock. Not too little, or the wort will invite strangers while it waits. He pours the starter in a wide spiral, the way you'd lace honey across bread. It sinks, then blooms, a pale galaxy opening in amber. The first bubbles appear not at the centre, but near the edges, where wood, yeast, and memory have had time to become friends. You stir once, a single circle with the clean paddle, making sure you don't bully the surface into foam too soon. The lid does not go on, the cloth does, loose and kind. Across the aisle, a low tun wears a contraption you've not yet met. A ring of smooth wood studded with pegs, like a halo set down to rest. "Yeast ring," Martin says. "We hang it between runs. A little balm stays in the grain of it, dries polite, wakes quick when it smells sugar." Quirky tidbit earns its seat. In parts of northern Europe, brewers indeed used carved wooden yeast rings or paddles. Later centuries call them kveik rings up in Norway, drying house yeasts on wood, so the next brew could carry the line like a family name. Here the practice is humbler, but the poetry is the same. Let wood remember. He dunks the ring, lifts it, watches a few hopeful bubbles cling like barnacles to a favourite pier. The first crock answers with a sigh. A stipple of bubbles lifts and breaks, and soon the surface has a living skin, the kind that looks like someone sprinkled the wort with poppy seeds that learn to float. You put your ear close, not too close. You'd rather not inhale theology. And it sounds like seltzer telling bedtime stories to a spoon. This is when Martin becomes a watchman rather than a worker. He pinches the linen back, checks the rate, adjusts the veil. There's a bell mark chalked on the post. Lords here, terce there, and he wants to see how the rise matches the hours. At terce, it should be counting its blessings, he says. At sext, keeping promises. Mainstream fact hums in your pocket. Fermentation is temperature's fussy child. Too cold and yeast sulks. Too warm, and it gets sloppy off notes that drift towards solvent or fruit when you wanted bread and meadow. Without thermometers, monks used room, stone, and season to steer thicker walls in summer, the leeward room in winter, a pan of cool water set beside a hot tun, if the yeast got ideas. You will not forget the sight of Martin setting his bare forearm gently against a vessel's side, and letting skin decide, with the confidence of someone who has been told by 1,000 crocks what colour their moods are. Historians still argue whether monastic houses cultivated distinct, stable strains, the famous house yeasts of later breweries, or whether a gentler churn of ambient yeasts and barm trades kept flavors in a family but not a fortress. Some charters boast of our drink's particular temperament. Others hint that neighbors swapped a ladle of foam the way they might share salt. You place yourself in the comfortable middle. Houses had their habits, wood learned their songs, and yeast, being yeast, did what it does, best adapt, charm, occasionally misbehave. A novice appears with a small bowl of feeding wort, the sweet first running set aside, and cool to top the starters if any look faint. He's the same one who once learned that hot stones are hot. The basket near the hearth is his curriculum vitae, and he carries the bowl with the reverence of someone delivering news. Martin nods him to one crock whose bubbles seem shy. 2 ladles, gentle as adding milk to tea, and the surface brightens as if it remembered its lines. You learn to read foam. Tight bead, steady, happy. Large blisters, collapsing with a sigh. Too warm or too tired. Lift the veil, hush the room, let the draught take a polite sip. A ring of lace clinging to the sides. The Krausen line. A rim that will dry to a story you can read next week when you clean. You own a new vocabulary and feel the grammar settling in your wrists. Light joke too. If languages are learned by immersion, tonight you've been dropped into yeastish, 101 with no phrasebook, and yet you can already ask, where is the library? And how many bubbles? Until none? Martin takes a wax tablet and scratches notes with a stylus. Batch mark. A little fish for fast day ale. Herb plan, yarrow at late. Boil time the hourglass lied twice. He adds, half smiling, pitch time between louds and terse. Room draft 2 shutters, and a rosemary veil. If it goes to market, he murmurs, we'll want to know why it behaved. The ledger will get the pretty version later. The wax keeps the heat of the moment honesty now. You admire an admin system that can survive a spilled ladle. The cat patrols the row tops like a forewoman on her favourite beam, stopping above the crock that's singing best to make biscuits in the air pores, kneading the nothing as if to bless the yeast with bread dreams. She naps halfway across the ring of crocks, tail dangling like a lazy question mark. Your shoulder relaxes in response, a reflex you didn't realize you had. If the cat trusts the room, maybe you can too. Martin teaches you the sign from the house's silent lexicon, meaning ferment lively, spread fingers fluttering once at chest height, and the one for hush it, palm down, a smoothing gesture over the air. You try both, and feel faintly ridiculous until a crock answers your flutter with a small brightening, like a child who saw the teacher clap and decided to clap back. Light joke 3. In unrelated news, you will be exclusively communicating with your morning coffee by hand signs from now on. Between vessels, you learn the emergency tricks no one writes in rulebooks. A ton rising too fast? Draw a bucket of cooler water to stand near it. Proverbially, borrowing cold steadies the air. A sluggish crock? Give it a whisper of yesterday's lively foam and a pep talk you will later call prayer. If true disaster threatens a contamination you can smell before you can name. Martin's face goes lunar calm and the cloth becomes a shroud. That batch will not see the gate or the refectory. Mercy is sometimes not serving what you made. He hands you a cup with a thumb-width of greenish froth. Taste once, he says, so you know the difference between bitterness on purpose and bitterness that complains. It's sharp, vegetal, like biting a dandelion on a dare. He sets a second thimble of sweet wort beside it. Your memory of where it started so your tongue can triangulate where it's headed. Already, the fermented sample from last week's batch hums with soft bread and a little green meadow from the yarrow. The new one points that direction with unsteady enthusiasm. You are convinced and, more dangerously, invested. The Belfateurse peels soft and clean through the rafters. On cue, the liveliest crocks lift their voices a hair, foam drawing lace like a doily your grandmother would have been proud to hide under a vase. Martin breathes out through his nose, the kind of contentment sound a man makes when a plan aligns with a tower. He lowers a reed tube into one vessel and puts his ear to the other end, not to drink, to listen. The sound is 1,000 tiny conclusions being reached. Historians still argue whether vessels were always this neat crocks lined up like soldiers, or whether many houses fermented wherever there was space and spare wood, tucking tons into corners the way families tuck drying racks. Some inventories list cellaria with dedicated order, others read like a scavenger hunt. Tonight, your room feels designed, not improvised, and you're grateful for the sense that someone thought about drafts and drainage before you arrived. You end with a small benediction of cleaning paddles rinsed, cloths reboiled, ring hung high, notes scratched deeper in the wax while the stylus still remembers. Martin draws a little fish beside the hour mark, a reminder for future you when the casks are tapped and someone asks, "Which batch was the Friday gentler ale?" You put your palm to the side of the happiest crock and feel warmth, thin as a whisper, travelling through wood and liquid into your skin. The room answers with a hush of bubbles, a lullaby that doesn't need words. You leave the veils lowered and the door on its latch. The cat slips out ahead, then pauses, tail up, to make sure you notice that she led. In the passage, the air tastes of rosemary and victory. Somewhere down the cloister, a novice coughs. A bird decides morning has beaten him into the world, and your hands smell faintly of Godisgood. You didn't expect to end up rooting for microorganisms, but here you are, the least patient person you know, suddenly thrilled to wait. You duck under a low lintel, and the air changes key cooler by a note, stonier by a chord. The steps spill you into the cellarium, where quiet grows on walls like lichen. Casks rest on cradles too deep, bellies round as moons in a slow parade. Some wear fresh pitch at the seams, black smiles cured tight. Others carry old scars from hoops refitted by a cooper, who talks to wood as if it were a skittish horse. A slit window admits a ribbon of daylight that remembers winter. The rest comes from tallow and habit. You taste oak and damp earth in your mouth, the way a cave writes its autobiography on your tongue. Brother Martin hands you the chalk. Not parchment and ink here, stone and stick. A board near the stair shows neat columns under simple heads. Fratres, brothers, hospites, guests, pauperes, poor, labour field hands and builders, and mercatus, market, below. Smaller marks divide by strength. Parvum for small beer, medium for every day, forte for feast or cold. You love a chart that tells you where generosity lives. The line for paupers isn't an afterthought. It's a lane. He walks you to a rank of casks and taps staves with a knuckle, listening for answers only wood can give. This one, he says, palm on a fish-marked head for Friday's gentler ale. And this, 2 taps higher up, is for the infirmarium. The monastery's sick room gets a softer draw, not for merriment but for medicine. Calories and calm are remedies the herb garden recognizes. Mainstream fact steps from the shadows. Monastic cellars were logistical hearts, controlling storage and distribution of food, wine, and ale. Some houses had an appointed cellarer, cellararius, whose job reached from larder to ledger, a stewardship recorded in rules and charters across medieval Europe. Tonight, Martin wears that hat lightly, chalk dust the only crown. You learn the law of gravity and the blessing of wedges. He sets a wooden wedge under a cask's near end, lifts with a lever's slow persuasion, and the bung aligns with the waiting pitcher on the trestle. The spile vent peg comes out with a sigh like a man sitting after a long day. You imagine the cask has opinions about bells too. A small tap slides into the bung. He twists. An ale answers, bright straw for parvum, deeper gold for medium. You hold the pitcher under the mouth and try not to look too pleased with reality. The chalkboard wants numbers, not poetry. Fratres, Martin says, and you mark today's ration beside an already modest tally. Hospites, he adds. 3 arrived before Lords. Their mugs get a dot in your head and a line on the board. Pauperes at the gate, he says, and you draw a careful stroke, steady as a promise. He reminds you what you learned upstairs. Fast days lean light, feast days lean kind, and labourers don't carry roof beams on small beer unless someone plans to watch beams fall. You feel the quiet power of allocation, how a stick of chalk can be a ladle. Quirky tidbit rolls out with the next cask. Martin shows you a shallow dish carved with a channel and a spout, the ale gauge or ale bowl used here as a measuring saucer for fair portions. In some towns, officials tested measures by filling a cup to the brim and checking for the legally required meniscus. Overbrim meant fines, underbrim meant lectures. He balances your paw to a line scratched by a patient knife. The rule likes justice, he says. So do thirsty people. You consider how many arguments in the world could be shortened by a good line on a wooden dish. Light joke 1. You vow to scratch calibration marks on your future cereal bowl to prevent oat inflation. Above your head, a thin thread of cool air slides along the ceiling, and out an arrow slit. The cellarium is a lung inhale from the stair, exhale at the stone. Martin points to vents cut low and high, to keep drafts gentle and barrels honest. On the far wall, a patch of whitewash is more polished than the rest shoulder height for a man leaning, proof that the cellarer thinks with his back against stone. A stool waits under a shelf blotted with grease from lamp bottoms and hands that carry both numbers and warmth. He lifts the bung on a large cask chalked with a little cross for feast. The smell is deeper, bread with a confident handshake. 2 days, he says, and it will go to the refectory for the nativity of Saint whoever needs us next. You grin. Saints rotate like taps in this house, a steady calendar of reasons to be gentle with each other. You set the spile back with a twist, and hear the cask settle into its cradle as if it found a soft word to lie down on. Ledger, Martin prompts, and you scratch small script on a wax tablet for later copying cask marks, draws, and destinations. He dictates just enough. Cask fish 2 parvum 10 measures, 5 freight trays 3 hospites 2 potpourris, infirmarium 2 measures medium from cross 1 and mark it none today. Your stylus learns to keep pace with his memory. The wax groans faintly, a pleasing sound like someone writing on snow. You follow him to the gate cask, a smaller barrel near a postern, where the porter can reach without performing acrobatics. He taps twice and listens. A finger shallow, he says, and you chalk a reminder fill later, before Vespers. You imagine the face of the grandmother from the gate on cold mornings, when her hands shake less after a small cup, and you press the chalk a shade darker than you meant to. The cat materializes, tail curled like punctuation, inspects the spout, and decides it meets code. Light joke 2. She's the only inspector who accepts bribes paid exclusively in ear scritches. You become a small machine. Draw, gauge, note, stow. The cellarium symphony is in quiet movements, tap whispers, spile clicks, the burr of chalk. More mainstream truth nods in. Medieval monasteries often brewed multiple strengths from a single mash, by successive runnings. Strong ale from the first, then small beer from the second and even third, so casks could serve different tables and days. You look at the row and can read the method now like a family resemblance, colours in order, chalk marks that tell the genealogy of a mash. Martin opens a chest and shows you tools that have more personality than half the people you know. A driver for hoops, a crows to cut the groove for a head, a sun-browned hammer with a handle polished by a century of persuasion. Cooper comes Thursday, he says. If the abbot's sermon goes long, Friday. The cellarium laughs without sound. Even barrels have homiletic schedules. You tap a hoop lightly and it answers with a ring that would make the bell in the tower nod. I'm tight. I'm true. Stop fussing. Historians still argue whether monastic distributions were egalitarian within the cloister, equal measures for choir monks and lay brothers, or tiered by rank and duty. Some account books suggest subtle hierarchies. Others imply a remarkable sameness at table. Differences saved for feast and infirmary. The debate tiptoes between ideals and logistics, between rule and reality. You write your chalk lines with the humility of not knowing, only doing right by this morning's names on the porter's list. You draw off for the infirmary and deliver 2 modest pitchers up the narrow stair, where a brother in a linen apron takes them with a nod that smells of mint and clean sheets. Back below, Martin gestures toward a cask near the market door, its head chalked with a little cart. If the weather holds, he says, we'll roll that one to town tomorrow. You imagine the street stones, a wheel's complaint, the taxman's eyes like measuring spoons, the assize of bread and ale prowls in your head. Authorities setting price and quality in villages and towns, reminding you that fair drink is public business. You add a note on the wax. Cart at prime, if not raining sideways. A shelf holds a small stack of wooden tallies, split sticks with notches kept for trades and trusted debts. Martin slides one apart to show you how cut marks match when the halves meet. A hedge against forgetfulness or fibbing. For the miller when he over-delivers, he says. Or the mason when we owe. You slide the halves back together and hear the tidy click of mutual memory. Light joke 3. You consider replacing your entire budget with notched sticks, until you remember your landlord does not accept medieval technology, except possibly when fixing the elevator. The board gains a few more lines, labourers sent to mend the cloister roof. Get the medium draw today. The scriptorium novices, cramped from copying psalms, get parvum with lunch, to put a little bread in the ink, as Martin says. He adds a dot under Mercatus for a small cask pledged to the baker, who saved yesterday's loaves when the oven sulked. Reciprocity travels on little wheels. A final circuit checks spiles snug, hoops content, wedges honest. He shows you the habit of marking a cask's head with a tiny diagonal, if it wept in the night just a whisper, and a second diagonal, when the cooper cures it, to tell the future how time was spent. You touch one such mark, a healed memory, and feel the urge to praise someone you'll never meet for doing the quiet work well. You hang the chalk back on its string. The board, modest as a grocery list, now carries the shape of a day. Bell-time draws, measured kindness, the strength of ale braided to the strength of hands. Above, a bell hints at none approaching. In the fermenting room, your balm is likely keeping promises right on schedule. The cat escorts you to the stair as if to say, "You've tallied enough for one morning, go brag to the bubbles." You pause at the last riser and look back once the cellarium holding its breath like a library that knows the plot turns out fine. Stone gives your feet back their warmth as you climb. Chalk dust crowns your fingers. Somewhere in your chest a ledger flips a page by itself, ready to add one more neat line to a night that has been mostly steam and listening. You follow the cool into the warmer hum above, and try, with limited success, not to feel unreasonably proud of a tidy column under pauperis. You carry the morning's logic back into the light where the bell folds a clean note around the yard. The refectory door stands open, linen bright as a cloud bank inside, and the serving hatch between kitchen and hall cues its own choreography bowls forward, loaves in a measured march, jugs waiting with a dignified thirst. Brother Martin sets 3 pitchers on the sill, parvum for small beer, medium for everyday strength, and a stout, honeyed forte that looks like it shook hands with winter and won. Your job is not merely to pour, it's to match mouth to moment, fast day, feast day, and everything in between. He starts by drawing a line in air with his finger, a small fish sketch you've learned to recognize. Friday, of course, and the menu leans simple. Legumes, bread that pretends not to be excited about butter, broth that saw a carrot go by at dawn. The ale follows suit. "Parvum," he says, and you lift the lightest pitcher, the one that glows like straw in good weather. Mainstream fact steps to the front of the line. Medieval households and monasteries often brewed small beer, a lower alcohol, lower gravity ale made from later runnings of the mash, precisely for daily hydration during fasts, for children, and for labour when the sun would do enough intoxicating on its own. Stronger ales guarded feast tables and winter bones. You feel the sense of it in your wrists, how the same grain gives multiple conversations, each matched to what the day asks. The refectory's hush is a kind of kindness. A reader stands at the lectern with a book you can't see, voice level as a pond. When the jugs arrive, hands lift them with the same care given to bread, and the clink of wooden mugs is the loudest thing the room allows. You top the server's pitcher's parvum first, and watch the level fall to a mark scratched in the jug's shoulder, a fair share sermon in wood. A lay brother winks at you, like a man who has seen your careful chalk columns below, and appreciates a volunteer who respects a line. Light joke 1. At home you eyeball pasta measurements with reckless abandon. Here, a scratched notch has converted you to the faith of precision. Outside the hatch, the almoner waits with a smaller jug and a ledger of faces. His list carries circles beside names older, fragile, nursing each circle a reminder that parvum isn't an afterthought. It's a thoughtful choice. You draw his jug to the mark, and he nods thanks that arrive as quietly as steam. The portress at the women's gate receives another, and you picture a traveller's shoulders dropping a half-inch when that first sip says, "You can stop trying to be heroic now." Not every day is light. When labour calls, roof work after a gale, stone hauling for a new wall, the measure shifts. Martin whistles you toward the medium cask, the one that smells like bread with posture. "Field hands and builders," he says, and you picture calluses, a ladder's rung worrying a palm, the way sweat asks your heart to vote for salt. Medium ale steadies without swagger. You pour into 2 broad-bellied pitchers and set them on the cart with a basket of hard cheese and a salt crock that looks older than good ideas. A novice takes the handles and disappears into the yard at the pace of a man married to gravity. "Forte," Martin murmurs, and the word hums its own bell. Feast days get a note in the ledger and a flavour in the cask. Richer, rounder, warming. The hospitality bench near the gate will taste it in thimbles, just enough to celebrate without turning noon into a cautionary tale. You draw a small testing cup and breathe honey and kiln. A whisper of yarrow from last night still reading poetry in the background. You set it aside because tasting while working is either quality control or a slippery slope, depending on who holds the cup. Light joke 2. You tell yourself it's research. Your better self replies that research does not require seconds. Fast days weave through the calendar like a quiet thread, and the brewery respects the loom. The sack marked with a fish upstream turns into parvum here. a chain of choices that feels more like intention than restriction. On ember days, the little seasonal fasts you've seen Martin write a small ember glyph on the slate by the ton, a reminder to sweeten the fasting table with care where you can. Better bread, a laughing ladle of pottage, ale poured with a grace that says, enough. The bell doesn't ring deprivation, it rings attention. Quirky tidbit sidles into the refectory from some archive of charming oddities. In a few places, monastic houses drafted polite rules for refectory noise that included not slurping ale like a ploughman at fair, a clause that suggests at least one enthusiastic brother once drank like he was racing geese. Another manuscript snipes gently at those who raise their mugs too high, as if the ale might hide better nearer the rafters. You watch the line today and see only careful hands, men who have made peace with their mugs and their neighbours. You file away the goose racing image for the feast after Compline when jokes are legal. Your day becomes ratios and faces. A pale woman at the guest table with travel in her shoulders gets parvum and a second ladle of broth. 3 men with lime under their nails return from the wall and receive medium. One rubs the small of his back and you add a nudge more with Martin's raised brow permission. A cart arrives with sacks of beets. The driver's cap is dusted white as a miller's, and his laugh is already married to the afternoon. He signs the porter's tally with a notch stick, then tips his head toward the cask like a man introducing himself at a dance. You comply. Light joke 3. You are, at this point, a sommelier of usefulness. And for our special today, may I recommend something that pairs well with lifting stones and not falling off ladders. Historians still argue whether monastic rationing by rank was standard. Did choir monks receive stronger ale than lay brothers, or did labour smooth the difference? And whether feast day measures scaled evenly or tilted toward those at the high table. Some accounts float idealism across the page. Others show hard-nosed logistics negotiating with generosity. You choose the middle road in your head, the one you've been walking all morning. The rule calls for fairness, the cellar calls for foresight, the day calls for small pivots in favour of bodies that need a nudge. The infirmary's window opens like a lowercase mouth. You knock and pass a tray with 2 small cups, and a folded note from the herb garden brother Mint and Fennel for the stomach that forgot how to be polite. He has scrawled, warm, slowly, which is both dosage and philosophy. In winter, you've seen him swirl a spoon of honey in a cup of parvum for an old man whose cough insisted on the last word. The cough lost that argument. The brewery, you realise, is a clinic dressed as a kitchen. Outside, the porter's bench collects a morning's worth of stories. A girl of 8 with a bandaged knee stares at your pitcher, as if it might recite a fairy tale. Her mother dips the wooden cup and offers a sip. The girl swallows, sighs, and stops glaring at the world. A pilgrim with scallop shells stitched to his hat, because he wants you to know he's been to the sea or intends to, drinks slowly, as if the cup were a mirror he's checking for the man he meant to be. You add a ladle to his bowl, and the silent lexicon sign for rest here tilts your head toward a bench. He obeys. Back at the hatch, Martin shows you the tally's afternoon face. We'll taper by none, he says. Let the work finish with its own strength. He draws a diagonal mark beside Mercatus, the market cask standing ready in the cellarium, and notes the weather with a single dot. Clear. Trade wants medium today. If the cart rolls out, Parvoum will travel only to the baker in exchange for tomorrow's loaves. You realise you're starting to think like a ledger that cares about people, which is the only kind worth keeping. Mainstream fact hums along the wall. Fasts in the Benedictine calendar weren't constant hair shirts. They were structured and seasonal, loosened for sickness, travel, and heavy labour, with abbots empowered to adjust. Drink followed suit, and small beer's ubiquity wasn't misery. It was prudence in a world where water and safe were not guaranteed neighbours. The picture is less stern than outsiders imagine. It's closer to a household that knows how to feed a field day versus a reading day. Between pours, Martin teaches you how to read thirst without asking. Dry lips, fast swallow, offer a second before they gather the courage. Lingering cup, frequent glance at the door. Pour modest, ask quietly if the road calls. A novice returns the jugs to the sill with a composure he did not possess when you first met him. He signs enough, with the palm-down smoothing motion you learned in the fermenting room, and you feel a little proud of a language that keeps learning new rooms. Quirky again, because your ears collect magpie treasure. Some refectories hung a wooden clapper near the door for last call, not because ale would run out, but because talk would. When the reader closed the book, and the clapper tapped, cups went down and gratitude stood up. You imagine a monk's hand on that clapper, the most polite bartender's bell in history, and decide the world should bring it back for meetings that run long. None leans in a lower sunline on the cloister paving, and the jugs lighten. You carry the last parvum to the scriptorium, where two brothers blink like owls over a page of psalms. Their knuckles are ink-stained, their spines negotiating with benches, and the cup puts a little bread back in their focus. One traces a letter with the side of his quill finger, and smiles as if the stroke finally obeyed. The brewery's gift made it to the margin and became neater. You close the loop at the cellarium chalkboard, adding figures that translate back into morning. Parvum heavier today, medium fair, forte mostly a promise. The cart symbol keeps its dot. The sky still says yes. You wipe your hands on a cloth that has opinions about your technique, and Martin sets the chalk back on its nail as if hanging up a key. The bell touches the air, calm and exact, and your chest returns the note without asking. Distribution isn't glamorous work. It is, however, the shape of care you can draw in a straight line. Seasons have opinions, and the brewery learns to negotiate. Winter speaks in a low voice that keeps yeast polite and cellars honest. Summer speaks louder, pushes, tempts shortcuts. Brother Martin lays his palm on a sun-warmed sill, and then on a shadowed barrel, translating the day like a bilingual cat. "We don't brew the same way," he says. "We brew with the day we're given." You've felt this truth since the coolship room breathed like a calm choir, but now the lesson opens its windows wider. Temperature is not an enemy to defeat. It's a partner to persuade. In cold months, everything feels easier. Wort cools like a well-trained student, crocks hum in a comfortable register, and cats nap closer to fires without pretending it's for your sake. Mainstream fact settles in beside the hearth. Across medieval and early modern Europe, brewing skewed toward the cooler seasons, because low ambient temperatures slowed spoilage and made fermentation steadier. In parts of the German lands, later statutes even banned warm-season brewing for common beer to prevent sourness and fires, proof that weather was not a footnote but a chapter heading. Martin doesn't need laws to explain it. He points to a chalked mark on the post, "Winter lift more," and you remember how he tuned the coolship shutters like an instrument. Summer, however, requires tricks. You walk the cloister and learn them as if the stone is lecturing gently. First, shade. The brewhouse breathes through narrow windows that never see noon. The coolship room lives under a high roof with louvers that sip rather than gulp. Second, stone. The floor is a flag of thick slabs laid on packed earth, and stone stores the night like a hoarder who actually has a plan. Martin shows you the night turn. Shutters thrown wide after Compline to invite cool in, then set to slits by prime to keep it. "We bank cold," he says, "the way we bank coals." Third, water. A shallow trough runs along the outside wall, spring-fed and shaded by hazel. In the hottest weeks, a ladle of that cool slips into a basin set near the liveliest crocks, not to chill the ferment directly, but to nudge the room's manners. He shows you a clay jar sweating under damp cloth, the old evaporative trick you already met above the pans, now promoted to room scale. Cloths wet and wrung, hung where a draught brushes them, drinking heat as they dry. You could make a modern fan jealous with nothing but linen and patience. Light joke 1. Somewhere your electricity bill just sighed. "We were the friends you made along the way." And Linen replied, "I'm cheaper." Quirky tidbit pads in, tail high, snow. In years when winter hoards enough, brothers pack it into pits lined with straw, a monastic icehouse that pays out in July like a cold bank. A cask that threatens to sprint can be ringed with last winter's quiet. A pitcher left in a pan of melt remembers how to be moderate. Not every house has the labour or the luck, but when they do, the snow pit turns into an annual festival of smug practicality. Martin taps a slate mark shaped like a mound and grins. "Saint Snowball," he says, patron of not panicking in August. The cellarium wears seasonal costumes too. In winter, vents close to a whisper and a brazier far from casks gives the cellarer's knuckles a reprieve. In summer, low vents draw cool from the earth while a high slit sighs hot air out. Martin shows you a leather flap he can hinge over a vent when a wind misbehaves, and a felt curtain he drops across the stair after deliveries, so the door doesn't undo a night's work in 5 minutes. He points out where the mason channeled the floor with a shallow runnel for wash water, the sort of detail that makes summer hygiene less dramatic. Clean is a season too. You check on the crocks and watch yeast translate the weather into punctuation. In winter, a tidy bead. In summer, eager fizz that sometimes needs a hand on its shoulder. "Cool your temper," Martin murmurs. lifting a veil 2 fingers width to let a shy draught persuade the foam back from the rim. He's seen 1,000 ferments and still treats each like a new student firm. Kind, no shouting. Historians still argue whether houses like this kept distinct, seasonally adapted yeast cultures, cool-loving strains for cold months, hardier ones for shoulder seasons, or whether reuse and trade made a single house character tolerate the year with small, clever nudges. Records are good at verbs pitch, feed, cool, and stingy with nouns. Which yeast? Exactly. So the debate bubbles on. Here, the answer looks like wood that remembers, and a cellarer who reads rooms better than most men read books. You visit the kiln and see how season edits malt, too. In damp months, the vent stays stubbornly open and the fire walks a longer circle. In bright dryness, the malt needs less coaxing and more watchfulness. Martin pinches a kernel that pretends to be dry, puts it to his teeth, and listens for a crack. The sound is a calendar entry. Too soft, and storage will sulk. Too brittle, and you've written feast day colour into a fast day sack. You appreciate that the task of the day is often, don't let the future curse your name. Ein rep to the ride. Out in the yard, a cart stands in the rectangle of the only morning shade long enough to count, and you help roll a feast cask into its shadow before the mule can object. The sun climbs, swaggering. You answer by draping a wet cloth over the cask's crown and tucking the ends like a swaddled child. It looks faintly ridiculous and entirely effective. The porter makes the sign for good in the silent lexicon thumb, brushes chin, and hands you a wedge of cheese in what might be the monastic version of a tip jar. Mainstream fact comes back around to your nose. The move from gruit to hopped beer had a seasonal backbone as well as a flavour tongue hops. Didn't just taste different. They kept ale better in warm months, thanks to their antimicrobial resins, letting casks travel and linger with fewer sad stories. You smell the clean line hops drew in last night's boil and understand summer's vote in the herb debate. The rosemary veils can chase flies. The cones guard time. The coolship room, now empty of steam, holds a different weather lesson. On the hottest days, Martin will skip brewing entirely rather than invite trouble. The slate board has a mark for that 2 short lines, like a closed gate. Prayer, he says with a shrug, is also work. On the brightest shoulder days, he moves the boil an hour earlier, so the pans meet more honest air, counting on dawn to look after them, while the world debates noon. You're starting to think the bell is less a tyrant and more a metronome in a band that knows how to swing. You ask about rain too much of it. He turns his face toward the roof like a man who knows every tile personally. Heavy wet hangs in the air and in grain, and damp malt sulks in sacks. The answer lives in lofts, sacks slung on rails, not floors. A candle test to sniff for the first unfriendly sweetness of mildew. A cat who considers loft mice her graduate thesis. The kiln burns low all day to convince the air to mind its manners, and the broom heads you used as tussocks find a second vocation as dew chasers around doorframes. Quirky again. On still nights when the yard refuses to move air, the brothers have been known to carry stiff linen fans like giant book leaves and read the room slow, synchronized sweeps that set a faint breeze over the pans. It looks absurdly ceremonial and works anyway. You try one, learn the wrist, and feel the immediate softening of hot corners. Light joke too. You've invented CrossFit for librarians. 3 sets of 10-page turns, rest on the cat. Winter has its own party tricks beyond the snow pit. The Steinbier stones you met earlier return to service when frost puts sulk in the strike water. Hot rocks learn to be gentle guests again. The fermentation room moves a step closer to the kitchen hearth, not for overheated drama, but for cozy constancy. Doors become gentle and quick, not dramatic and drafty. If a freeze threatens to make the spigots betray you, the cellarer wraps them in twined straw like little straw beehive mittens. Your modern brain writes this down as if it were a hack. Martin's face writes it down as, of course, not a did. You want to know when the house decides the ale is ready to travel in any season, and the answer is both when it tells us and before the road starts complaining. He watches the cask's breath at the spile, tastes the edge, losing its greenness, listens for a settle in the ferment room that sounds like the sea deciding to nap. A bell mark on the post. None or Vespers coordinates not just prayer, but cartwheels. He avoids sending beer out at noon in August for the same reason you avoid wearing a wool cloak to the summer haying. Dignity only gets you so far. Historians still argue whether the consistent, cool ferment lagering of later centuries has monastic ancestors hiding in these cellars, caves and stone vaults, where ale rested longer and cleaner. or whether what you're watching is simply good, seasonal ale practice, not a proto-lager manifesto. Some see a lineage, others warn against reading future fashions backward. You let the debate pass like a cloud over the garth and keep stirring with the present tense. The casks don't care what century claims them. They care about shade and patience. The bell, which has patiently watched you play meteorologist without laughing, puts a note into the yard. You read the sky's answer. A thin breeze, a mercy. Martin tilts a shutter here, lifts a veil there, and the house exhales. It's the same work, he says, just different kindnesses. You file the sentence where you keep the best ones, the kind you can use when the world asks you to adapt without becoming someone else. By the time you've done a full-circuit coolship room, crocks, cellarium, refectory, the day has become a weather report you can smell. Rosemary sits light on the air. Stone gives back its hoarded night. The cat selects the single square of sun on the sill with the confidence of a queen. You pull a cloth from a bucket and wring it for the cask by the gate, laying it across the crown like a blessing. A traveller will arrive before long. You want the first cup to taste like shade. When Martin presses his forearm against a vessel and closes his eyes, you mimic the gesture, and your skin reads a sentence the way he taught it. Steady, it says, not sulking. Your smile answers without words. Light joke 3. You will now be touching random kitchen bowls at home and declaring them within range. Family members should prepare their supportive nods. You leave one shutter raised a finger wider and think, not for the first time, that the monastery's brilliance is being unembarrassed by small solutions. Linen, stone, shade, snow, drafts politely managed, none flashy, all faithful. The bell agrees with a nod you feel in your ribs. The season can be stern or generous. The house will meet it with tricks that are really just attentions. You walk back toward the fermenting room, practicing the wrist of those linen fans, because the cat has expressed wordlessly, but emphatically, that you could be better at it. The porter's bench leans into the morning like a man who already knows the punchline. You bring the gate cask forward with a roll and a grunt, wedge under, spile out, and the first cup of parvoum walks itself into a pair of grateful hands before you can say, good day. Hospitality at the threshold has a choreography you've learned by watching. A nod, a cup, a second if the road is still speaking loudly in someone's bones, and a quiet, sit, if you like, signed with the palm-down smoothing gesture you've adopted as if you were born to the cloister. The bell crosses the yard brief, bright, and you time your pause to it the way a baker times loaves to the oven's breath. Pilgrims are easy to spot if you know what to look for. Shells stitched to hats, little badges pinned to cloaks, tiny metal saints with the confidence of talismans dust in the seams of their sleeves, and a walk that has forgotten swagger and chosen endurance. You set a cup in a palm nicked by rope or rosary, listen for the story, and keep the cup full enough that the story finds its feet. Mainstream fact walks through the gate with them. Pilgrimage was a major feature of medieval life routes to Compostela, Canterbury, Rome. So common that towns staked their identities and economies on the flow. Hospices, monasteries, and confraternities tended to pilgrims with bread, a mat, and, very often, a mug. Your bench is one dot on a map of dots. The cup turns geography into kindness. You top a mother's cup while her son stares at the cat as if she were a heraldic beast. She allows a single ear scratch payment accepted before settling on her post as gate quality control. A mule snorts in the lane. 2 traders, with a bolt of wool wrapped in oiled cloth, angle toward the refectory to ask the almoner about lodging. You give them the same parvum, the same sit, if you like, and a warning about the bell when it calls. We hush, delivered with your best smile, which you hope translates into their language. We are glad you're here, and also, we like our schedule. Martin arrives with the cart, and the little cask chalked with a wheel Mercatus bound. The cooper's hoops gleam with recent persuasion. A wet cloth sits ready to play tethered shade over the crown. You help lever the barrel up, bind it with a strap that knows its knots, and watch Martin set a tally stick and a wax tablet near the driver's seat. We sell with a memory, he says, and we come home with one. The porter taps his clapper, 2 soft clicks that mean cart on the road, and you fall in behind the mule, a dignified procession of 3, animal, cask, and optimism. Town is a quick rattle down the lane hedge. Field, hedge, a stile where someone has drawn a very good chicken with coal, and then a gate where 2 men with polite boredom and less polite spears note your barrel. Permissions live here, and coin lives near permissions. Martin tips his hood. The nearer guard raises an eyebrow that says he knows ale without meeting it. Assize? He asks. And you nod, because this town observes the assize of bread and ale, those standards for measure and price that shape a market day like a spine. They don't like surprises, and ale is a stranger who introduces itself in mugs. Light joke 1. You consider telling them your ale is certified, gluten appropriate for the 1/3 century, but your survival instincts vote no. The market square wakes like a big, friendly animal. Stalls lift their wooden wings, baskets lean toward customers as if flirting, and a fishmonger invents a song to make herring glamorous. You tuck the cart into the shade of a lime tree that remembers spring too well. Set the cask on its cradle, and hang a wooden token carved with your mark, a little fish, same as on the Friday sacks and the solarium chalk. A town ale conner official tester arrives before you can adjust the cloth. He carries a clean cup and a sense of purpose. You draw him a small measure. He sniffs, sips, nods. Mainstream fact takes a bow. Many towns appointed ale tasters to enforce quality and price. They had the authority to fine brewers and shut down cellars who cheated measure or sold sour beer. You watch his face, the way sailors watch gulls. He folds your taste into his ledger and strolls off to judge someone else's morning. Quirky tidbits scuffs in on humour. There's a story you've heard twice now that some ale conners used leather breeches and sticky benches to test sugar, pour ale on a plank, sit, and if your trousers stick when you stand, the brew's hearty. If not, someone watered it. Whether this town risks breaches is unclear. Today's conner uses his nose and a practiced tongue and preserves his dignity. You preserve a solemn expression while your brain sets the mental headline, Inspector escapes seat with honour. You sell by saucer line and tally tick. Housewives with sharp eyes check your meniscus. You meet their gaze, glad for the scratch mark in your measuring bowl. A baker trades yesterday's favour for today's half measure. A fiddler moves his case closer to your shade and makes coins more buoyant by adding tunes to the air. A constable ambles by with the theatrical gait of a man who likes to be seen ambulating. Martin hands him a thimble no more and receives in exchange a warning about a tax clerk with a fondness for recalibrating measures. You adjust the bowl to the exact line with the ferocity of a saint defending doctrine. Historians still argue whether monasteries selling ale in town were beloved as fair dealers or resented as competitors. With tax privileges, charters sometimes blurred what they could sell and when. Neighbours sometimes grumbled. Some towns welcomed the steady quality, others policed it as zealously as the worst tavern. The record refuses a simple moral. Your morning refuses one too. You smile at a housewife, keep your saucer honest, and remind yourself that goodwill is a cask you can either fill slowly or kick over in a minute. Between sales, Martin trades rumours with a vintner whose eyebrows say he mistrusts anything that foams. They swap notes on road conditions and on a band of pilgrims who sang so beautifully at last. Complin that even the geese stopped heckling. You pour for a mason whose forearms are a treatise on leverage. He drinks, sighs, and says, not thin, not pushy, like a good neighbour. You decide that's your new brand slogan and then decide the rule would roll its eyes at brand slogans. Light joke 2. You compose the world's softest marketing plan, ale that minds its own business, for people who also mind theirs. A boy with a wooden hoop runs a circuit too close to your trestle. You catch the cup before it leaps like a salmon. The cat, who has absolutely not followed you to town, except she has, materializes under the cart and deploys her calm on the boy with surgical precision. He kneels. She endures. Order returns. You pour for a woman with a basket of onions that threatens mutiny. She nods once, pays in 2 coins, and a thumb-thick onion you will later swear was a gift for the kitchen and not a bribe for your salad. Mid-market, a man with a tidy cap and a tidy ledger clears his tidy throat. Tax. He measures your measure, weighs your coin, and inquires about your permissions with a voice so polite it could cut cheese. Martin produces the abbey's writ parchment. Seal, the smell of a previous abbot's tidy day, and the clerk's tidy eyebrows relax by a degree. You learn the town's choreography for we see you, we see your paper, carry on. You also learn that the clerk keeps his own tally stick, and you admire the way both halves of his keep secrets they only reveal to each other. Mainstream truth nudges your elbow. The price of ale under the assize adjusted with grain cost. Brew weak and sell dear, and you earned a fine. Brew strong and sell fair, and you earned a line in the town's memory for doing right. You see the invisible arithmetic in the clerk's head, and you feel the arithmetic of your own. Grain, time, heat, herbs, cart, shadow, coin, charity. The sums must meet in the middle and shake hands. You end your market with a few small jugs earmarked for the hospice on the far side of town, and a thimble in a wrinkled hand that remembers summers better than ladders do. The sun rounds toward a different angle. You tuck the cask cloth more carefully and pour the last saucer for a midwife whose bag tells you she never sleeps. She drinks like a person who knows the measure of things and nods as if you've measured well today. Light joke 3. You resist asking her to bless the cat in case you need a patron saint of not knocking over trestles. On the way home, the mule decides to think deeply about a patch of sun. You let him. The cart creaks. The empty cask makes a hollow drum that your feet answer on the road. At the town gate, the guards notice the cat on the cart and decide against writing it down. You pay a small road toll that is, in reality, a fee for listening to a man describe a pothole for 5 minutes. Beyond the fields, the monastery's bell strokes the air, the sound turning the lane into a hallway you've been walking all your life. Back at the porter's bench, the almoner glances at the sun, then at your faces, and reads the morning without asking. You roll the cask to the cellarium, chalk market, fair, clerk, tidy, Connor, not sticky, on the wax tablet with a flourish that will make future you smile, and set the cart shaft down with the ceremony of a man finishing a sentence he enjoyed writing. Martin counts coins, breaks a few toward the alms bowl, and tucks the rest away where ledgers will later domesticate them. The cat takes payment in shadow naps. You return to the gate for a last cup before none, and a pilgrim with scallop shells asks if the bell means what he thinks. It means everything, you say, and hand him parvum that tastes like roads choosing to be kind. The bench creaks. The crows argue philosophy in the tree over the wall, and your pulse matches the tower, as if your ribs were little beams the bell decided to tune. The cart rests in the shade, permission papers re-rolled and tied. You rest too for the length of a sip, before the next kindness asks for your hands. You learn the house's quietest art with the simplest tools. A ladle, a candle, a nose you've been training since the first bell, and a mouth that promises to be honest even when honesty frowns. Brother Martin sets 2 cups on the bench, yesterday's finished ale, and a thimble of today's mid-ferment drawn a moment ago. We taste to keep our promises, he says, and you feel the pledge sit upright in your spine. The room smells like bread and rosemary veils, and the faintly green shadow of yarrow you met at the boil. You start with the finished cup. Breathe with your mouth slightly open. He taught you catch grain with the nose, herbs with the upper palate, hops in the afterword. It lands as a line you recognize now. Barley first, then the meadow note, then a clean farewell that makes room for bread and conversation. Mainstream fact sets its mug on the table. Medieval quality control was hardly guesswork. From the assize of bread and ale in English towns to monastic cellars ledgers, people tracked fairness, flavour and fault. Arleconers tested, abbots scolded, and houses that cared kept notes, some long, some brief. All pointed at not wasting grain or goodwill. Then the diagnostic fun begins, which is a nice way of saying, you sniff for villains. Martin teaches a small litany of if, then. If you catch a whisper of raw cabbage or sweet corn at the rim, your boil was shy, drive it harder next time. DMS may be a new name, but the nose is an old judge. If the ale tastes like a buttered wooden spoon left in the sun, don't panic. Let the balm finish its housekeeping. Yeast will reabsorb that buttery mischief if you give it another bell or 3. If the sip leans nail polish sharp, or turns the back of your throat into a scolding aunt, too hot a ferment, or too thin a pitch, you cool the room's temper and pitch more generously next batch. Light joke 1. For the record, you've never before been thrilled to learn that more bubbles later is a legitimate solution. You meet the gentle sour that's a friend, and the sour that's a gossip. Pleasant tang in the direction of fresh bread and apples. A cool day lactic sigh that small beer wears well. Vinegar bite that tries to iron your tongue flat. Air went where it shouldn't. Or a cask pillow slipped and let ascetic interlopers set up house. Remedies are practical before they're romantic. Scald what can be scalded, retire what cannot, and reroute the too sharp batch to the kitchen, where it becomes mustard, pickle, or salve. Nothing is wasted. Not every brew is a drink. The ledger will record kitchen as neatly as refectory, and pride will step aside without making a speech. Oxidation. Martin doesn't call it, but he knows its taste. Stale paper, wet straw, ale that seems to have sat in a story too long. That's a cooper's conversation, and a cellar's map. Tighter hoops, quicker racking, less gossip with the spile open. He touches a cask head the way you touch a friend's shoulder when they've overtalked. You'll listen less next time. Clove and pepper peek around corners, pleasant in some houses. In others, a hint that the barm remembered a wild cousin you didn't invite. If it tips into bandage or medicinal, the herbal chest gets a veto, and the scalding bucket gets a starring role. You learn that a monastery's cleaning is more sacrament than chore. Boiling water over paddles and rings, scalded cloths, sun-bleached linen, and wood aired till it smells only like itself. Mainstream truth, tucked into steam. Sanitation, though they never used your modern word, was the difference between our ale is steady and our cat thinks we've opened a vinegar shop. The cat arrived without being summoned, approves this policy with a blink, and assumes the role of sensory panel, reclining perilously close to the cups like a shareholder. Quirky tidbit pads in wearing seaweed. Along coasts, some houses swear by a scrap of dried carrageen Irish moss dropped into the boil to help proteins crowd together and fall. The sea lends a hand, a brother told Martin long ago, and he keeps a jar for winters when clarity needs a nudge. Inland, they mutter, show off, but will trade cheese for a pinch when their own pans look cloudy as gossip. You make a note on your private map. Remedies have accents. Light joke too. You add speaks fluent seaweed to your CV, right below cat whisperer, junior grade. You practice the house's triangle finished, mid-ferment, and a blend to train your tongue. The blend is not deception, it's prophecy. Can the green edges of today's ferment plausibly become tomorrow's balance? If yes, you smile. If no, you look for levers. A longer rest to let barm knit roughness, a cooler corner, a decision to divert. Blending finished casks is its own monkish diplomacy. This one's shy bitterness complements that one's generous grain. The cellarium becomes a quiet marriage broker. The ledger records the union. The refectory reaps harmony. Copper helps. Martin reminds you gently. Kettles tell microbes fewer bedtime stories, and so does air in the right place at the right time. Vigorous boil, quick cool. You realize most remedies are simply attention paid at the earlier step. The herb chest is the last violin, not the first. No amount of rosemary peel and pray will cover a boil that refused to be brave. Still, herbs have small mercies. A late yarrow aromatics whisper can lift a flat nose. A breath of bog myrtle can steady sweetness that threatens to wander. Historians still argue whether monks had a formal vocabulary for faults, specific names and fixes, or whether their language stayed mostly in the realm of good, honest, sour and thin, with remedies carried in, hands and habits rather than words. Some point to surprisingly technical notes in later brewery records and see a lineage. Others see a patchwork of practice that never calcified into doctrine. Your night suggests a truth between a grammar of gestures, longer boil, cooler room, scalded cloths, patient balm, and a poetry of noses that didn't need Latin to be precise. You learn the candle and spoon trick, monastery edition. Hold a clean wooden spoon in the steam for a count. Sniff the condensation off notes. Concentrate where water kisses wood. A cabbage whisper now means a scold later. A honey straw means you're on the path. Martin also shows you the rope test. Dip a clean flax cord into the cooling wort and lift. If it sheets like oil, your sugars are still thinking. If it drips in strings, you're closer to proper extract. It's not science as your century names it. It's science as theirs lived it, memorized by wrists. When a cask rings dull, when tapped waterlogged stave or hidden weep, the cooper's calendar moves forward. Remedies aren't only liquid, they're wood and iron. A hoop tightened at the right hour is a recipe adjustment written in metal. A bung-carved truer is a bitter error erased. The cellarium is a clinic for objects with fevers, and the cooper, when he comes, is very much a physician with hammers. Not all off-notes are failures, some are signatures. The fast day parvum tolerates a sprightly tang, the feast day forte would reject as rudeness. The market batch leans cleaner than the refectories because road and sun are sterner critics than brothers who forgive. You taste with destination in mind. The porter's bench gets warmth without swagger. The infirmary gets silk without edges. The labourer's midday gets backbone with manners. Remedies are relative. The bell does not ring one flavour for all. Quirky again, feather light. Some towns kept a judging bread, a small loaf baked to a particular blandness, used as a palate reset between ale tastings. Bite, sip, decide. Martin laughs at the idea, and tears you a heel off a coarse loaf anyway. It works. The taste returns to baseline, The cat does not approve of sharing. You make mistakes in safety. You overpinch a late herb. Martin catches your hand and turns the gesture into a lesson. A level spoon, a two-finger pinch, the silent sign for less. You misread a shy sour as a rude one. Time proves you wrong, and kindly. You write, "Wait," on the wax tablet with a small circle beside it. A promise to your future self that patience is also a remedy. Light joke 3. If only you could apply this to inboxes and relatives. We've decided to fine for off notes. Recommended correction, a nap. Aside, mainstream fact steps back in with its sensible shoes. Reusing healthy balm from a successful batch is the medieval backbone of consistency. A living library passed bowl to bowl. When the song goes off key, swapping to a neighbor's balm trusted, proven can reset the choir. House yeasts travel in wooden rings and in friendship. Quality control is sometimes hospitality under another name. You picture a ladle passed over a hedge with a nod, and a batch saved because someone believed in sharing. Historians still argue whether coastal moss finings and inland egg white tricks touched ale this early, or mostly wine. Some sources hint at experiments, others stay mum. Martin shrugs toward the sea jar, uses it rarely, and relies more on time, gravity, and a careful vorloaf to polish the wort. You find comfort in a toolkit that starts with attention and ends with humility. By late afternoon, your notes read like a weather diary for tongues. Batch fish, 2 clean nose, yarrow bright, balm content, cross 1 edge of butter, hold 2 bells, market blend cask, C, spined, with D, smine. The cat initials none of it, but Nap approves. You set the cups to soak, scald the ladle, and chalk a small check beside the casks that match their promise. Out the door, the bell lifts a patient note for Vespers. Remedies have been mostly small heat here, cool there, wait, blend, clean. It occurs to you that most of life's repairs resemble this list if you stop insisting on drama. Martin pockets the wax tablet with the same care he gives the salter. Tomorrow, he says. The ale will tell us if we listened. You breathe in a last ribbon of bread and meadow, and let your shoulders drop the width of a stave. The monastery goes on with its quiet diagnostics. Linen held to light, casks tapped for truth, noses making maps, hands correcting without fuss. You follow the bell toward the next task, grateful that an old house teaches you to fix things gently before they break loudly. Vespers folds itself back into stone and the house turns its face toward Complin, the way a field turns toward evening without thinking. You and Brother Martin make one last slow orbit of the brewery, a constellation of small closures that feel like tucking in a large, obedient animal. The kettle wears its lid like a nightcap. The fire has been argued down to a drowsy red coals spread thin, no log left arrogant. You draw the rake once through the ash, a line that looks like a path in fresh snow, and the hearth answers with a sigh that seems to say, "That will do." In the fermenting room, the linen veils receive a final, knowing pinch at each corner. A few crocks breathe with gentle conviction, bubbles pacing themselves like monks in procession, no sprinting, no drama. You listen for mischief, and hear only cooperation, the small fizz of promises keeping. Mainstream fact stands quietly at your elbow. Compline traditionally ends the working day in Benedictine houses, and with it begins the great silence, no unnecessary talk until after prime, so that rooms like this must learn a second language of gestures. The brewery's silent lexicon is not a quirk. It's how craft survives the night without tripping over piety. You smooth a veil with your palm as if erasing a wrinkle from sleep. The cellarium asks for 2 last kindnesses. You set a felt pad under the gate cask's wedge, so footsteps by the door won't jar the spile. You nudge a cloth across a crown to keep curiosity from settling where it shouldn't. The chalkboard gets a dot beside refill gate cask at prime, the sort of dot future you will bless before coffee exists. A cask head marked with the little cross-feast batch rings true when you tap, then surprises you with the softest weep at the hoop. Martin twists a tiny sliver of rush into the seam tonight's tourniquet, and the bead vanishes like a thought you were right to catch. Light joke 1. If only all leeks in life could be convinced by a polite piece of grass to stop making a scene. You climb to the coolship room for one last look at the night's weather. The shutters hold their narrow smiles. Rosemary veils lift and settle, a sleeping lung. The pans lie empty now, dried and scalded, a silver orchard waiting for another harvest. You hang the rake on its peg, same angle, same height, because tomorrow's you deserves not to play. Where did I put the only rake that works? The cat ghosts in, leaps to her beam with the creak of a book opening, and decides your audit passes. You accept your certification with appropriate humility. Down in the yard, the bell stirs, a bronze throat clearing. Compline flows from the nave, the antiphon a soft ribbon that remembers every winter. You follow it a few steps, then pause to bank the last chore. A bucket of hot water poured over paddles and rings. Steam writing thank you letters on the rafters. Cloths wrung and hung like flags of truce. Quirky tidbit pads up from the dormitory stair. Some houses appointed a lanternarius, a monk whose nightly duty was to shepherd, shield, and then pinch the lights, part sacristan, part lifeguard for flames. Tonight, Brother Petrus, your human alarm clock from earlier, plays that role. He moves down the cloister with a money's worth of caution, cupping each flame like a secret. You step into the cloister walk and the garth receives you. Mint and damp earth conspire to invent a new colour of calm. The columns are shadowy rosary beads. You are one more finger tracing them. Historians still argue whether, by the later Middle Ages, monks here would already be in individual cells rather than a common dormitory, whether cubicles rose like wooden hedges within a large hall, and whether silence at night was strict everywhere or softened by local custom, small houses, whispering solutions while bigger ones wrote them down. The debate whispers at the edge of the chant. The lived truth tonight is simply hush with purpose. Back in the brewery, Martin checks the sand glass upended at the boil, ignored on purpose since, and turns it down to empty, a small ritual of nothing left to do that you feel in your shoulders. He draws a fingerfish on the wax tablet beside the words parvum, gentle, infirm, silk, then snaps the stylus closed with the tidy pleasure of a man who has finished today before tomorrow interrupts. He shows you the last gesture of the silent lexicon for the shift. 2 fingers touch to the rim of the tun, and then to the heart care kept. You return it with more accuracy than you had this morning. The fire gives up its final gold. You lay a flat stone over a stubborn glow, a winter trick conscripted to summer duty, so no stray draught will persuade it to remember ambition at midnight. A leather bucket, half full, waits like a chaperone at the hearth's elbow. The room's scent spread, green bitterness. Rosemary's soft spine drop their volume until they sound like memory with good posture. Light joke 2. Consider bottling this aroma as eau de compétence, notes of malt and personal growth. Unfortunately, the marketing dept is currently observing the great silence. A last sweep for tools. A hand tested against a tun's flank. Steady. A pause to scratch the cat exactly once, contractually mandated, and the brewery's door eases toward its latch. You do not shut it hard. This house doesn't like slamming. The latch catches with a sound you want to write down, click as benediction. Somewhere beyond, the dormitory prepares its own choreography. Sandals set neatly, belts loosened but robes kept on parole. Bodies aligned for breathing more than for display. Mainstream fact nods. Benedict's rule indeed counselled communal sleeping, and readiness lamps lit until all were in, clothes worn, knives managed with common sense, even as later centuries slid toward private cells. Vigilance was a virtue that slept light. You follow the chant's diminishing braid down the corridor, the floor cold through your soles in a way that tells you everything will be fine. The porter eases the outer wicket shut. The herb garden stands at attention like a mild, fragrant army that has already won. You pass the gate bench and imagine it tomorrow with new faces. You pass the cellarium and feel the casks listening in their wooden dreams. The bell speaks Compline's last note, and the silence that rises afterward isn't emptiness. It's a room being returned to itself. At the dormitory threshold, Brother Petrus raises 2 fingers, lantern down, breathe, and the light dims into a polite star. You make your bed of tonight's work not on straw but in the catalogue of small mastered gestures. A boil staff raised at the right minute, a shutter tilted a thumb's width, a chalk line drawn fair for palpares, a rosemary veil tied without hurry, a ring of wood baptized in balm and hung to remember. Light joke 3. Also on the list, surviving cat supervision with minimal performance reviews. You slip into the dark like a page going back into a book. The brewery continues without you, yeast whispering, casks deciding, stone mothering cold. Yet you are in it, the way water is in bread after it bakes, not visible, entirely present. If you listen hard, you can still hear the coolship room's linen breathing and a crock hiccuping itself content. The night rolls you once toward sleep and says, with a voice that smells like barley and iron, "We've got it from here." And now the edges soften, the way steam thins when the room stops asking it to be dramatic. The bell's last echo slides into the rafters and becomes a hush that carries you, one easy breath to the next, like a shallow boat rocking on a pond that knows the moon. You can let go of the kettle and the ledger, of the hourglass and the shutter angles. They remember their work. They remember yours. Nothing needs you to hurry. Picture the ton as a slow, warm hill in a summer field rising a finger, falling a whisper, while the crocs count quietly, not to 30, not to anything, just counting because counting is steady. Your shoulders can be stone now, holding nothing, storing a cool that takes hours to speak. The rosemary veil is only a fragrance, and it goes lighter and lighter again, until it's just the idea of a garden through an open window. Even the cat curls smaller, becomes weightless architecture, a soft punctuation in the sentence the house is writing. You turn one last time, and every small task you did tonight turns into a smooth round pebble, laid one by one along a path that doesn't need light to be found. The fire is asleep, the door is latched, the casks are breathing in their wooden way. The porter's bench has forgotten all the names, and will be glad to learn them anew when morning finds the gate. Your breath lengthens, evens, and the chant you can no longer hear keeps its rhythm for you anyway. Slower, softer, the floor cool underfoot becomes a memory under your back, then a cloud, then nothing at all. If a bell rings now, let it be inside a dream, and let the dream be a warm cup set down on a table you don't have to clear. The night is doing the rest of the work. You are welcome to sleep,